Outpost of the fallen Prologue. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, blood-red shadows across the barren landscape of the war-torn country. Lieutenant Elena Westbrook, Royal Air Force pilot, steadied her breath as she gripped the control yoke of her jet, a fighter engine that had become as much a part of her as the air in her lungs. This was supposed to be her final mission, a farewell to the skies before she hung up her wings for good. But nothing, in this forsaken place, went according to plan. A split second. That's all it took. A burst of gunfire from below, a flash of metal as the missile hit. The world went white, a violent jolt of the craft. The instruments blinked out one by one, and Elena's stomach dropped as the horizon spun. Her heart pounded, a primal beat that matched the tremor in her hands. She tried to regain control, but the jet was already tumbling. She pulled back on the controls, fighting gravity, but it was no use. The ground loomed closer, a jagged scar of earth that seemed to reach up for her with deadly intent. The last thing she remembered before the impact was the sound of her own scream, lost in the roar of the explosion that tore her world apart. When she woke, she was on the edge of consciousness, her head throbbing as though it were being crushed by a vice. Her body felt like it was made of broken glass, every movement sending sharp electric pain through her. Blinking away the haze, she managed to prop herself up, her boots digging into the rocky earth beneath her. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized the jet was gone, reduced to a heap of twisted metal and fire somewhere to the west. There was no one around. The quiet was deafening. She looked out at the ruined landscape, an expanse of craggy mountains and bombed-out villages, a landscape so alien and hostile that it felt like she'd been transported to the very edge of the world. But it was the faint glow of something beneath her that caught her attention. There, hidden just beneath the rubble of the decimated stronghold, was an entrance. A faded sign above it, half obscured by moss and decay, read, Outpost Theta Research Facility. Her survival instincts kicked in. She had no choice but to investigate. The bunker's entrance was barely visible, but the narrow shaft of light that flickered from within beckoned her forward. It was a mirage, an unlikely sanctuary in a land full of killers, both human and not. As she descended into the darkness, her senses tingled with unease. The air was thick, heavy with a strange, metallic scent that twisted the insides of her stomach. The deep hum of machinery echoed through the walls like a distant heartbeat. But there was something else in the air, a sense of awakening, something ancient, something hungry. Elena knew one thing. The war outside had nothing on the monsters, waiting for her in the depths below, and this was just the beginning. The creatures would soon rise. The hunt was on. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Depths. The darkness swallowed her as she descended into the cold, concrete belly of the bunker. Elena's breath quickened, her pulse echoing in her ears, competing with the distant, rhythmic hum of machinery that seemed to vibrate beneath the very ground. Every step down the narrow staircase felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something that had been waiting far too long. Her flashlight cut a thin beam through the oppressive blackness, revealing walls lined with rusting pipes and cracked concrete. The air was thick, stale, untouched for years. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, even though her every instinct told her the opposite. She was on edge, hyper-aware of every creak and groan the structure made underfoot. The faint light of her flashlight flickered as she reached the bottom, revealing a long corridor stretching out before her, lined with heavy metal doors. Each one bore a faded number on the frame, scrawled in what looked like chalk. Sector B1, Test Lab 7, Containment Room 14. The numbers and labels meant nothing to her, but the air of secrecy, of something hidden in the depths, gnawed at her. She had no choice but to move forward. "Stay calm, Elena," she muttered to herself, forcing a breath to steady her racing heart. "Just find a way out. Find a way to survive." Her mind raced back to the crash, the explosion, the fire, the mission. It had all been supposed to be so simple. A quick strike on the enemy's territory, a high-risk but essential operation. Instead, She had been shot down, stranded, and now, alone. There was nothing she could do to reverse what had happened, but survival was her only option now. Training had taught her that much, but the deeper she walked into the bunker, the more she felt like she was being drawn into something larger, something other. There was a strange vibration in the air now, a low hum, almost like a heartbeat. The longer she stood still, the more she could feel it in her chest. It was as if the place itself was alive. A door at the end of the corridor creaked open, and her heart skipped. She hadn't seen anyone, not a soul, but the door had moved. She was sure of it. Had she been mistaken? The place was in ruins, abandoned, yet it seemed active. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and flee, but she couldn't. She couldn't shake the nagging pull, the feeling that something, someone, was waiting for her to cross that threshold. If on cue, a blast of air swept through the corridor, raising the hairs on the back of her neck. A low growl vibrated from within, a noise so primal it made her breath catch in her throat. Something stirred in the darkness beyond the door, something alive, something monstrous. Elena's fingers tightened around the handle of her sidearm, her knuckles white with tension. She was trained for this. She had fought in the skies in the middle of a war. This was something different. But the one thing that had kept her alive so far was her ability to adapt. Without another moment's hesitation, she stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the unknown. The room she entered was cavernous, the ceiling stretching high above, her lost in shadow. She could see the outlines of machinery, strange and archaic, scattered about the space, but it was the shape in the center of the room that caught her eye. A large metal capsule, its surface slick and gleaming despite the decades of neglect. Suddenly a sound cut through the silence, the faintest of hisses. Elena froze, her breath caught in her throat. The capsule was moving. She instinctively crouched low, her body pressed against the cold concrete, her eyes never leaving the slowly shifting object. A mechanical whine echoed through the chamber. As the top of the capsule began to lift, inch by agonizing inch, revealing something dark within. Her heart raced and a flash of cold sweat trickled down her back. As the lid of the capsule finally opened, a figure stirred inside. At first, she thought it was a man, perhaps a soldier who had been in stasis for years. But then the figure moved, and Elena's breath hitched. The creature that emerged was no man. Its body was grotesquely contorted, its limbs too long, too jagged. The skin, a slick mottled gray, stretched over its sinewy form. Its eyes were an unnatural shade of pale yellow, glowing faintly in the dark. There was no human expression on its face, only hunger. It let out a guttural growl like a beast roused from its slumber. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth, too many to count, and Elena's body froze in terror. The creature took a step forward, and another, its movement swift and fluid, unnaturally so. Elena's hand shook as she raised her weapon, her finger hovering over the trigger, but something stopped her. This wasn't just a creature. This was something else, something engineered, a monster born of a twisted, godless science, and it was awake. A voice, low and guttural, whispered. Through her mind, "You shouldn't have come here." Before she could react, the creature lunged. Chapter 2. The Hunt. Begins. Elena's heart nearly stopped. Time slowed as the creature lunged toward her, its predatory growl echoing through the cavernous room. The space between them was nothing, a mere instant of predation. She barely had time to react, but her instincts kicked in, and she dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its slashing claws. Her body hit the cold concrete with a painful thud, the breath knocked out of her. The sound of its feet scraping against the floor reverberated. In her ears, followed by a low guttural hiss. Elena scrambled to her feet, her sidearm gripped tightly in her hand. She barely registered the pain in her shoulder as she twisted to face the creature, which was now circling her, its glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. She steadied her breath, forcing her mind to clear. Focus. Survival, above all. The creature's movements were swift, almost too fast for her to track. It was circling her like a predator, its claws clicking against the concrete with each step. It was studying her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Shit, Elena muttered under her breath. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything she could use. The room was cluttered with strange equipment, computers, broken machinery, and steel tables, but nothing that could give her an advantage. The creature wasn't human, and it certainly wasn't bound by the same physical limitations. It was something else entirely. A flash of movement. The creature charged, its claws extended razor-sharp and glinting in the dim light. Elena barely had time to roll to the side, narrowly evading its swipe. But the creature was relentless. It spun on its heel, closing the gap faster than she could react. A feral snarl escaped its lips as it leaped at her once more. This time, Elena was ready. She fired a single shot, the crack of the gunshot reverberating through the chamber. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, but it barely seemed to notice. The wound didn't even slow it down. Instead, it let out an enraged roar, its eyes blazing with fury. How do you kill something like that? In desperation, Elena scrambled. Backward, her back slamming into one of the steel tables. She caught a glimpse of something heavy, a metal rod on the table. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it with all her might, connecting with the creature's side. The impact sent it reeling, but only for a moment. The thing recovered too quickly. It was like trying to fight a nightmare. "Come on, Elena, think," she shouted to herself, her mind racing. She couldn't take it on with brute force. Her weapon was useless against it, and every time she swung, she felt like she was wasting precious seconds. The creature hissed, its body low to the ground as it crept toward her, its muscles coiled like a spring, ready to launch itself at her again. Suddenly, there was a noise, a faint whirring sound that vibrated through the walls. The ground trembled slightly, a low rumble that shook the steel framework of the bunker. Elena froze, looking around in confusion. The creature paused as well, its head snapping up in alarm. For a moment it stopped moving, its yellow eyes shifting in every direction, as if listening for something. And then, with a low growl, it retreated a few steps, its gaze still locked on Elena, but it wasn't charging anymore. She didn't have time to wonder what had just happened. The rumbling grew louder, more pronounced. Something else was coming. The hum of machinery, now a constant vibration beneath her feet, grew more intense, and then the sound of footsteps, heavy, metallic, and purposeful, echoed from the hall outside the room. The creature seemed to sense it too. It growled again, but this time it turned its back on Elena, retreating into the shadows of the cavernous room. It didn't flee entirely, but it wasn't attacking anymore. The strange energy in the air was thick with something new. Whatever is coming, it's worse than this thing. Elena quickly scanned the room, her heart still pounding in her chest. The door leading into the hallway, the only way out, was still open. She didn't think she could take another confrontation with the creature, not when she didn't know what else was lurking in the dark. But the creature wasn't the only threat in this place. With her sidearm gripped tightly in her hand, she darted toward the door, keeping low to the ground, her eyes never leaving the shadows in the room behind her. She passed the metal rod on the floor, but didn't stop to pick it up. The rumbling grew louder, and she could hear the grinding of gears, like the awakening of a machine far too large to be human. The air was filled with static, as though the entire facility was about to spring to life. She entered the corridor at a sprint, her boots pounding against the concrete as she made her way back toward the main entrance, toward any escape. The creature hadn't followed her, yet. She didn't have the luxury of knowing if it would. The hallway was just as cold and sterile as the rest of the bunker. The low electronic hum still vibrated the walls, and Elena's pulse quickened. She rounded a corner and was met by a massive steel door, its surface emblazoned with the words, "Containment Zone, Authorized Personnel Only." Elena hesitated, her fingers tightening on the door handle. Was this where the danger had come from? Was this where the creatures were born, where they were kept? No time to question it. She shoved the door open, and as she stepped into the room, beyond, she was met by a scene that froze her in place. There, in the center of the large, dimly lit room, was a series of glass tanks, each one filled with strange, writhing creatures. Some were humanoid in shape, their pale forms suspended in the liquid, while others were something else entirely, half human, half beast, their skeletal limbs twisted in unnatural angles, their eyes unblinking and hollow. A mechanical voice broke the silence. Subject containment level 1 breach. The glass tanks began to crack, and Elena realized with a sickening jolt that the creatures were waking up. Chapter 3. Breach. The hum of the machinery reached a fever pitch, a shrill whine that pierced the air like an alarm. Elena's eyes widened as the glass tanks began to crack. First, it was a faint web of fractures, but then the cracks spread, like lightning, spiderwebbing across the glass with terrifying speed. A sharp metallic sound rang out as one of the tanks shattered completely, the pieces of glass spraying out in a glittering explosion. Elena's breath caught in her throat as something alive stirred within. A hand, no claws, emerged first, followed by a head. The creature's features were distorted, twisted. Its eyes, pale yellow and feral, blinked, adjusting to the dim light, and then it let out a sound that could only be described as a low growl, something guttural and alien. One by one, the other tanks followed suit, each one unleashing a creature more grotesque than the last. Some were humanoid, their limbs bent in unnatural angles, while others were far worse, monstrous amalgamations of human and alien features, their skin slick and gray, their mouths filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. A hiss echoed from the back of the room as one of the creatures, its mouth gaping open, let out a screech that made the walls vibrate. Elena's hands trembled, and she could feel her stomach lurch. These weren't just creatures, they were experiments. The twisted offspring of some unspeakable science, created for purposes unknown, and now they were free. The sound of shuffling, feet, strange movements, and low growls filled the room as the creatures began to stir, stretching and awakening from their long stasis. Their limbs jerked as if they were unaccustomed to movement. Their eyes locked onto Elena, and for a moment she felt as though the air itself had turned to ice. Run. Now. Elena didn't need a second warning. Her heart pounding in her chest, she turned and bolted toward the door. She could hear the sound of claws skittering against the floor behind her, the rush of breath and the guttural growls of the creatures as they followed. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The door. She needed to get to the door. Her boots pounded against the concrete as she sprinted down the hallway, the heavy thud of the creature's footsteps growing louder with each passing second. She turned a corner and nearly slammed into another door, one that led deeper into the facility. It was locked. No time for this. She spun around, desperate, scanning the hallway for any possible escape. At the far end of the corridor, a narrow stairwell led down into the bowels of the bunker. It was her only chance. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the stairwell, the sound of the creature's pursuit growing louder, closer. They were fast, faster than anything she'd ever encountered, and the smell of their presence was suffocating, a rancid metallic stench that made her gag. It was like they were made of something that didn't belong in the world. She reached the bottom of the stairs, panting heavily, her hand already searching for the next door. She burst into another darkened room, and this one was colder than the others. The air was thick with a damp, metallic smell, and the walls were lined with what looked like more containment units. But these weren't just tanks. They were full of data, computers, monitors, and strange-looking machines. Some of them were still operating, blinking with dim red lights. The sound of claws skittering on metal reached her ears. Her time was running out. What the hell were they? She wasn't sure she wanted to know. But there was something in the air now, something more. The machines, the monitors, they were all connected to something. A larger system, a network of sorts. She stumbled to one of the computers, hands shaking, and yanked a keyboard toward her. The screen flickered to life, displaying lines of code and data she couldn't understand, flashing warnings about containment breach, alpha, beta, gamma, critical levels. Elena had no idea what it meant, but she knew one thing. The more of these creatures that got out, the more dangerous it would become. She slammed her hand on the keyboard, trying to override the system, anything to stop the madness. But the screen froze. The hum of the machinery around her intensified, and a voice crackled through the speakers in the room. It was low, mechanical, but distinct. Warning. System breach detected. All containment protocols overridden. Evacuation advised. Evacuation? There was no evacuation. Elena's eyes darted to the back of the room where another door stood, this one thicker, reinforced, and leading even deeper into the facility. The rumbling from above had intensified again, and she could hear the distinct sound of something massive moving toward the room. It wasn't just creatures anymore. It was something else, something larger, something that could command them. She needed to act fast. With a final, desperate punch on the keyboard, the screen blinked once more, and a new message appeared. Override complete. Containment protocols disabled. Access granted to secure level. Before Elena could fully process what she had just done, the walls around her seemed to tremble. The noise from the hallway was getting louder, closer. The creatures were nearly here. Without thinking, Elena sprinted toward the reinforced door, her pulse racing. She yanked it open, stepping into the next chamber. The room was large, a massive chamber filled with steel scaffolding and strange mechanical contraptions. In the center of the room was another figure, taller than the rest, its back turned, bathed in a faint blue glow. It looked human, but not. The shape was too tall, the limbs too long. The air in the room thickened as Elena stepped closer, her breath shallow, her gun raised. There was something wrong with this figure, something off about the way it stood there, unmoving, as if it was waiting for her. She took another step forward, her instincts on high alert, and then the figure turned around. It was not human, its face was a horrific fusion of organic and mechanical parts, like something that had once been alive, but was now far beyond the realm of anything natural. Its eyes were dark and hollow, and its mouth split into a grotesque, toothy grin. A voice, cold and metallic, filled the room. "Welcome, Lieutenant Westbrook. We've been expecting you." Elena's blood ran cold. Chapter 4. The Architect. The words hit Elena like a slap in the face, reverberating through her mind with an icy chill that froze her in place. "We've been expecting you." The voice was so smooth, so deliberate. It carried a sense of authority, like it had been orchestrated for this very moment. Like Elena's arrival had been part of a larger plan. The figure, this thing, moved toward her, its tall frame cutting through the dim light like a shadow. Its limbs were unnaturally elongated, the joints stiff and mechanical, but there was something human about its posture, something vaguely familiar, if not utterly horrifying. Elena's instincts screamed at her to raise her gun, to shoot first and ask questions later. But the cold metallic voice echoed in her head again, and her hand tightened around her weapon, not knowing whether to shoot or flee. "I see you're surprised." "Don't be. Your arrival was anticipated." Her pulse quickened. Anticipated? How? Who was this thing? What the hell was going on? Who are you? Elena's voice was tight, edged with fear, but she held her ground. She wasn't about to let her terror take control. She was a fighter, and she needed answers. The creature, if it could even be called that, tilted its head slightly, as if amused. Its eyes glowed faintly, pale and empty, like an abyss that could swallow her whole. "I am the Architect, the creator of what you see around you, the orchestrator of everything that has happened here." It took another step closer, and the hairs on the back of Elena's neck stood up. "You were chosen because your kind, are the last piece of the puzzle, the final ingredient in our design." Elena's heart hammered in her chest. She took a slow step back, keeping her gun steady, though her hand was trembling. Her mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, what this thing was saying. "The last piece of the puzzle? What design?" she asked, her voice shaky but defiant. She couldn't show weakness now. She had to understand what she was dealing with. The architect's mouth stretched into a smile, a grotesque, unsettling gesture. The evolution of humanity, Lieutenant. The future of your species. A new dawn of life, one that transcends biology as you know it. The creatures you've encountered are the result of my work. The union of science, warfare, and the unknown. You could say I have engineered a new form of life, one that surpasses all limitations. Elena's stomach twisted. These things, these creatures, were the product of someone's twisted mind, a sickening mix of human and alien designed for… What? She swallowed hard, trying to fight back the surge of bile in her throat. You created them? Elena's voice was a harsh whisper. She couldn't wrap her mind around the magnitude of it all. Why? For what purpose? The architect's eyes darkened. Its expression grew cold, almost disinterested. Purpose is subjective. What matters is that they were designed to be superior, stronger, faster, beyond the weaknesses of mere mortals. They are the next stage of evolution. As for their purpose, well, they are a means to an end. A tool, a weapon to change the balance of power in this world. Elena's thoughts scrambled to connect the dots. Power, weapon, control. She was beginning to understand. The war-torn country she had been sent to, this was all part of the larger picture. The creatures, the bunkers. It was all about warfare. About controlling the future of humanity. By unleashing something that could not be contained. And she had walked straight into the heart of it. Before she could respond, a low growl echoed from behind her, followed by a series of hissing sounds. The creature, the thing, was not alone. Elena's heart dropped. She whirled around, her gun instinctively raised just as several of the monstrous creatures she had seen earlier slithered into view. Their glowing eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. They were hungry. The architect stepped forward, its movements so fluid, so unnatural. You see, Lieutenant, you were never supposed to make it this far. But now that you have, I suppose you're the perfect test subject. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Test subject? She didn't have time to process the implications. Before one of the creatures lunged toward her, its claws scraped the floor with a sound that made her teeth grind. She fired, but the bullet only slowed it for a second, just long enough for another creature to close the distance between them. Her mind screamed for her to move, but the architect's cold laughter echoed in the room. I've been watching. You, Elena. I've been studying how you think, how you react. You are more than just a pilot, you're a fighter, and I admire that. But you're not ready for what's coming. Her gun clicked empty. She cursed under her breath and ducked just in time to avoid a swipe from one of the creatures. Her sidearm was useless now. She had to get out of here, and fast. But the architect stepped closer, blocking the exit. The only way out is through. You will become part of the new world, or you will perish with the old. Elena's mind raced. There had to be another way. She darted to the side, making a break for the only remaining exit she could see. The creatures followed, fast, relentless, hungry. But Elena was faster. She grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it at the nearest creature, knocking it back with a sickening crack. Another came at her from the other side, and she swung again, this time landing a blow to its head. It stumbled, but it didn't fall. Damn it! She needed something else, anything else. She turned toward the controls in the corner of the room. The computers, the monitors. There had to be something she could use. There, at the center of the room, a massive red button blinked with a warning sign. Emergency Protocol Facility Lockdown. That's it. With no hesitation, Elena sprinted toward the control panel, slamming her fist against the button. The entire facility seemed to shake as alarms blared. A shrill, deafening siren filled the air. The lights flickered and then went out completely. The walls groaned as if the very structure of the bunker was protesting. Lockdown. Let's see how… Your creatures like that. The architect's furious voice echoed in the darkness. You think you've won, Lieutenant? You've only just begun to understand what you've unleashed. But Elena didn't stop. She ran through the chaos, the shrieking creatures behind her, but the doors, steel reinforced, slammed shut, sealing them inside. She was free for now, but the architect's final words haunted her as she fled into the depths of the bunker. This is only the beginning. Chapter 5. A Taste of the Future. The wail of the alarms grew louder in Elena's ears as she ran through the winding corridors of the facility, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls around her seemed to hum with a nervous energy, the occasional burst of red emergency lighting casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. The creatures had been contained, at least temporarily, but Elena knew that their confinement wouldn't last long. The facility was unstable, and so was, her mind raced, the architect. That thing, it wasn't just some twisted scientist. It was something worse. The leader of whatever this sick, insidious operation was, a creator of monstrosities, and now she had set those monstrosities loose. But what did the architect mean by test subject? Why had it been so focused on her? Why had it expected her? The tightness in her chest had little to do with the physical exertion of her sprint. It was the crushing weight of the truth settling in, the realization that she was far deeper in this nightmare than she could have ever imagined. The war zone above had been a distraction, a smokescreen for a much darker agenda brewing beneath the surface. She skidded around a corner, her boots sliding on the smooth concrete floor. The hallway ahead was empty for the moment, but she could hear the growls and shrieks echoing in the distance, a constant reminder of what was waiting for her. She had no doubt the creatures were already starting to test the lockdown. They were fast, intelligent even. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she glanced over her shoulder. Nothing yet. But the farther she ran, the more she could feel the walls of this place closing in on her, like a trap slowly tightening. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind her, unmistakable in their rhythmic pounding. A hiss followed by a low growl. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to turn around to know they were on her tail. The creatures were smarter than she had given them credit for. They had adapted. They knew how to follow, how to hunt. Elena rounded another corner and reached a heavy steel door. She didn't hesitate, slamming her hand on the control panel beside it. The door clicked and groaned, but it wasn't opening fast enough. Damn it, move, move, move. She turned, scanning for another way out. There was a small ventilation shaft overhead, just wide enough for her to squeeze through. The creatures weren't likely to be able to follow her there. She had to risk it. Elena jumped, grabbing the edge of the shaft and hoisting herself up. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain, focusing on the small opening above her. A moment of disorientation. As she crawled into the narrow tunnel, the air was stale, heavy with dust and the smell of something long forgotten. But there was no time to stop and assess. The screeches and shrieks of the creatures echoed louder in the hallway below her. She could hear them clawing at the door she had just left behind. It wouldn't be long before they found a way through. She crawled faster, the cold metal scraping her palms as she moved deeper into the vent system. The narrow space felt confining, almost claustrophobic, but it was better than the alternative. As she pressed on, she couldn't shake the architect's words from her mind. The future of your species, a new dawn of life. What had it meant by that? Had these creatures, these half-human, half-alien abominations, been made for war? For domination? Were they the next phase of evolution, as the architect claimed? Or was it all just a twisted experiment? Elena didn't have answers, and she didn't have time to find them. She was too far from the surface now, too deep inside this hellish facility. She needed to escape, but she had no idea how much longer she could keep running before the walls closed in on her. The air in the vent became thicker, almost suffocating. She paused, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The dim light above her flickered, casting long shadows across the narrow tunnel. She was starting to feel the weight of the isolation, the eerie quiet of the ventilation shaft pressing in on her. She needed a plan. Elena squeezed through a final bend in the shaft and came to an abrupt stop. At the end of the vent, there was another grate, a larger one this time. Beyond it, she could see a faint glimmer of daylight. The outside. She was so close. She pressed her palm against the grate, trying to pry it loose, but it was welded shut. She cursed under her breath. Another dead end. Think, Elena. Think. There was no time to dwell on the panic rising in her chest. The creatures were closing in. The architect had been right about one thing: she was being tested. She was part of the experiment now. Suddenly, a thought struck her. What if the architect wasn't the only one with a plan? What if there were others inside this facility trapped just like her? Others who had been swept into the nightmare? Elena's hand froze as she thought about the possibility. A message came to her then, a distant memory of a briefing, a brief mention of the contingency team that had been sent to investigate this place before the communications were cut off. The team, the ones who had disappeared. They could have known something. They might have had the key to getting out. She slammed her fist against the grate in frustration, the noise echoing through the confined space. It was the only option she had. She needed to find them. A loud crash rang out from behind her, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. The creatures had found the shaft. No time to waste. Elena pressed forward, her heart pounding as she scrambled out of the vent. She kicked at the grate, her boots catching the edge. It gave with a screech, and she tumbled out onto the cold, hard ground of a vast open chamber. The chamber stretched out before her, dimly lit by overhead lights that flickered erratically. Rows of strange machines lined the walls, equipment she didn't recognize, and strange containment pods that seemed to pulse with an ominous glow. She wasn't alone. There were figures moving in the shadows, not just the creatures. Her breath caught in her throat. There were others. Elena took a cautious step forward, and one of the figures in the shadows shifted, their outline becoming clearer. A human figure, tall, gaunt, and disheveled, but unmistakably human. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a man, mid-30s, with ragged clothes and wild, bloodshot eyes. He didn't look surprised to see her. Instead, there was a glimmer of recognition and then a crooked smile. "Well, well, well," he said hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "Looks like we're not the only ones still alive down here." Chapter 6. Allies in the dark. Elena stood frozen, her eyes locked on the man who had emerged from the shadows. The air between them seemed to thicken with uncertainty, but the flicker of hope in his gaze, tinged with exhaustion, spoke volumes. This wasn't just another survivor. This was someone who had lived through whatever nightmare had unfolded in this place. And maybe, just maybe, he knew how to escape it. "Who are you?" Elena asked, her voice steady but edged with caution. The man was tall, lean, with a rugged, almost feral look to him. His face was weathered by days, perhaps weeks of hardship. His clothes were torn, his hands stained with dirt and grime, but his eyes. There was something in those eyes, something that told her he wasn't just another frightened victim. "Name's Morgan," he rasped, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I've been stuck in this hellhole longer than I care to remember." Elena took a cautious step forward, her instincts still on high alert. Her hand instinctively went to the holster at her side, but she didn't pull her weapon. Yet. There was no telling how long this man had been alone, or how dangerous he could be, but she could see the desperation in his eyes, the same kind of desperation she felt. He was a survivor, just like her. "Where's everyone else?" Elena asked, her tone softening as she studied him more carefully. "The team that was sent here? The one investigating all of this?" Morgan looked down at the ground for a moment, his face contorting with a mixture of bitterness and pain. He seemed to wrestle with the question before finally meeting her eyes again. "They didn't make it," he said flatly, his voice hollow. "I don't know how many there were, but I'm the last one standing. Everyone else. They either got caught or turned into whatever those things are." Elena swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She had expected the worst, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it made it all too real. She had to suppress the wave of anger that threatened to rise in her chest. "Why didn't you escape?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. There was no escaping something like this, not without the right resources or knowledge. The place was a maze and the creatures were everywhere. Morgan's gaze hardened, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Escape? There's no escape from here. Not unless you've got some way of cutting through the security lockdown or shutting down the whole damn system. They've got this place on lockdown and there's no way out unless you're wanted out." Elena's mind raced. A part of her wanted to reject his words, wanted to push forward and force an escape. But the reality of the situation was sinking in. The creatures were relentless, and the architect, the mastermind behind this twisted operation, had control of the entire facility. Is there any way to stop them? The creatures, I mean, she asked, desperation lacing her voice. The question had burned inside her ever since she'd seen the horrors lurking behind those glass tanks. She had to do something to slow them down, if not stop them completely. Morgan's lips twisted into a grim smile, as though he'd been waiting for her to ask that very question. You can't. Not unless you destroy the source. These creatures, whatever they are tied to the system, to the experiments running in the lower levels. They're not just born here, they're made here. Elena frowned, her mind working quickly to connect the dots. The lower levels? What's down there? Morgan glanced behind him, his expression darkening as he looked down the hallway toward the deep cavernous chambers that stretched beyond the dimly lit corridors. The source, he said, his voice grim. Where they're breeding, growing. All the twisted science, the machines that turn human into that. He gestured vaguely toward the darkness, his face hardening with a mix of fear and resolve. The architect's operation isn't just about creating weapons. It's about creating an army, one that won't stop until it has the world in its grasp. Elena's blood ran cold. An army. She could feel the weight of the word. An army of these things. Her thoughts immediately flashed to the global conflict, the war zone above. She had been sent to do recon on a rebel stronghold, but had no idea that the true enemy was far more insidious, hiding under layers of military secrecy and a twisted laboratory. She had been sent here to investigate, but now it seemed like she had become part of something much larger, a far more dangerous game. So, what now? Elena asked, her voice low but determined. She was done feeling helpless. She had to keep moving. Morgan took a step closer, his eyes scanning the hallway behind her, ever vigilant. There's a way out, well, a way down, deeper into the facility. There's an old service elevator I've been trying to reach, but the system's been in lockdown since the breach. If you can get down to the main control room and disable the lockdown, we might have a shot at getting out of here before the whole place comes down on our heads. But you need to be careful. Those things aren't the only threat down here. Elena looked at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes for just a moment. She wasn't used to trusting others, not when survival was this uncertain. But Morgan's words made sense. She couldn't face this alone. She couldn't beat the architect, not without taking out the source of the chaos. And Morgan, for all his rough edges, was a survivor. He knew this place. Lead the way, she said, her voice steady, a sense of resolve settling over her like armor. Morgan nodded sharply, his expression hardening. Follow me, but don't expect an easy ride. We're not out of this yet. With that, he turned and led her down the narrow, dimly lit corridor. Elena kept close, her senses alert, listening for any sign of movement in the shadows. The creatures could be anywhere, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they moved deeper into the heart of the facility, Elena's thoughts remained fixed on one thing. The architect, the twisted figure who had created this nightmare. If she had any hope of stopping the madness, she had to find a way to shut him down, and his monstrosities, for good. Chapter 7. Into the Abyss. The air in the hallway grew colder as Elena followed Morgan through the labyrinthine corridors of the facility. The dim lighting overhead flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The silence between them was heavy, each step they took reverberating in the eerie quiet that seemed to hang over the place like a suffocating blanket. Morgan moved with the kind of purposeful precision that came from knowing a place too well. He had clearly spent more time here than was healthy, but Elena didn't have the luxury of time to process that. She focused on the task at hand, getting to the control room, disabling the lockdown, and then finding a way to stop the horrors below. Her hand tightened around the grip of her weapon, though she had no illusions that it would be enough to stop what awaited them. They reached a set of stairs leading downward, the cold metal steps creaking underfoot as they descended deeper into the bowels of the facility. The stench of decay grew more pronounced with every step. It was a mixture of old blood, sweat, and something else, something foul that churned Elena's stomach. "How much farther?" Elena asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. Morgan didn't answer immediately. He glanced at her over his shoulder, his face drawn and grim. "Not far. We're almost there." His tone held a sharp edge, as though the proximity of whatever lay below him unsettled him in a way he didn't care to show. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Elena's stomach turned. Ahead, a massive metal door stood between them, and what Morgan had promised was the heart of the facility's operations. The door was more heavily secured than anything she had seen so far, with reinforced steel plating and several access points that required security clearance. Morgan stopped in front of it, his hand hovering over a panel. "The control room is just beyond this door. It's where all the systems are run. If we can break through, we can disable the lockdown and get the power systems under control." Elena nodded, though her unease only deepened. Something about the door, something about this whole situation felt wrong. The silence was suffocating, too heavy for a place that should be buzzing with activity. Morgan turned to her, his face hardening. "Once we get in, we'll need to move fast. The lockdown's holding for now, but if we don't act soon, the creatures will breach the outer zones, and we'll have no way of stopping them." Elena braced herself. She couldn't afford to hesitate now. Whatever happened next, they had to move quickly. She watched as Morgan worked quickly, punching in a series of codes and commands. The panel beeped, then hummed with the sound of unlocking mechanisms. The metal door slowly began to open with a grinding noise, revealing the inner sanctum of the facility. A vast, dimly lit control room, its walls lined with screens and rows of complex, pulsating machinery. The room felt sterile, cold, as though it had been abandoned long ago, but it was anything but. Before she could take another step, a shrill noise echoed through the room, a high-pitched, almost mechanical screech that made her blood run cold. Elena's heart skipped a beat as she instinctively raised her weapon, scanning the dark corners of the room for any movement. Morgan cursed under his breath. "Damn it, they're here." Elena barely had time to react before she saw them, the creatures slithering out of the darkness, emerging from hidden crevices. Their glowing eyes flickered in the low light, and the grotesque shapes of their half-human, half-alien bodies seemed to distort with every movement. They were silent predators, moving with a terrifying speed, their twisted forms a grotesque mockery of humanity. "Get back!" Elena shouted, firing a quick burst at the nearest creature. The bullet struck its chest, but it didn't even flinch. It only growled, its mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. Morgan cursed and pushed forward, grabbing Elena's arm. "We need to go, now!" But the creatures were too fast. One lunged at them with terrifying speed, claws outstretched, ready to strike. Elena didn't hesitate. She fired again, this time aiming for the creature's head. The bullet tore through its skull, sending it crashing to the floor in a bloody heap. But the others were closing in. More of them. They moved in a coordinated way, hunting in packs. "Upstairs!" Morgan shouted, pulling Elena toward the stairs they had just descended. "We've got to get out of here before they overwhelm us." As they sprinted toward the stairs, Elena risked a glance over her shoulder. The creatures were relentless, pushing forward with terrifying focus, their eyes glowing. In the dark, their movements were inhuman, almost calculated. Intelligent, she realized with a sinking feeling. These things weren't just mindless monsters. They were engineered to hunt. They reached the bottom of the stairs, but before they could make it to the next corridor, the ground beneath them rumbled with a low, resonant growl. The walls seemed to shake as if the whole facility was coming to life, or worse, dying. Elena's pulse raced. Something was wrong. "Move!" she urged. But before they could take another step, the entire hallway ahead of them was blocked by a massive figure. A hulking creature, larger than the others, stepped into the path. Its skin was mottled, a mix of human and alien features, its eyes glowing with a menacing hunger. It was unlike any of the creatures they had encountered so far. A leader of sorts. The architect's voice echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of its words. "You think you've won, Lieutenant? You've only just begun to understand what you've unleashed." The creature grinned, if it could even be called that, its jagged teeth stretching wide in a grotesque mockery of a smile. Morgan stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he took in the creature's massive form. "We're not getting past this one," he muttered under his breath. "It's an apex predator, made for taking down anything that threatens the system." Elena's breath hitched. She had faced threats before, battles in the air, ambushes on the ground, but this thing was different. This was something engineered to be a weapon with intelligence and strength far beyond anything she had encountered. "Do you have any ideas?" Elena asked, though her voice held little hope. They were cornered, trapped. The only way out seemed to be through the creature standing in front of them. Morgan gave a short, bitter laugh. "I have a few," he said, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "But they involve getting very creative." Elena's grip tightened on her weapon. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But with the creatures closing in and the pressure mounting, she knew their options were limited. The creature lunged. Without thinking, Elena fired. The bullet struck its shoulder, but the beast didn't flinch. It only roared, shaking the walls with the sound of its fury. "Now!" Morgan shouted. Elena spun around, grabbing a nearby control panel and smashing it open. Sparks flew, and the lights flickered, but she kept moving, her mind working furiously to override the security systems. There was no other way out, no other chance, except to make their own path. And if that meant sacrificing what was left of this place to escape, then so be it. Chapter 8. Breaking the system, Elena's fingers flew over the control panel, sparks flashing in her peripheral vision as she ripped open the wiring and jammed her fingers into the exposed circuitry. The humming of the facility was deafening, a constant reminder of the giant machine that was keeping everything, including them, contained. She could feel the weight of time pressing down on her. Every second they wasted meant more creatures coming for them, more risks. Behind her, the massive creature roared again, the sound vibrating through the floor. It was close. Too close. Come on. Elena muttered under her breath, ripping apart wires and reconnecting them as she desperately tried to override the system. Her heartbeat thudded in her chest, matching the rhythmic clang of the creature's claws as it scraped. The floor behind her, moving closer. Morgan was still firing, but his shots barely slowed the beast. He was buying her time, but not much. "Hurry up!" he shouted over the noise, his voice strained. He had already fired several rounds into the creature's tough skin, but it barely registered, its primal instincts far outmatching any conventional weapon. Elena didn't look up. Her focus was fixed on the tangled mess of wires in front of her. She needed to do this now, or they were all dead. With one last desperate tug, the console sparked and then clicked. A series of beeps filled the room as a green light flashed. On the control panel, Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I've got it," she said, her voice hoarse. "The lockdown's been disabled. The power's fluctuating, but we've got a window." Morgan didn't waste a second. He grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the nearest exit, his face hard with determination. "Move, Elena. We don't have time to wait for the backup systems to go live." The hallway was dimly lit now, the power surging on and off as the systems rebooted, flickering like a strobe light. The creatures in the facility were not so easily stopped. Their inhuman eyes gleamed from the dark as they closed in on their position. But with the lockdown down, the corridors were now open. More space, more chaos. The air felt like it was thickening around them, the weight of impending death pressing in from all sides. The creatures were fast, too fast. And now, with the facility's systems in disarray, their every step echoed down the hallways, threatening to collapse on them. Morgan pushed forward, his hand still gripping Elena's wrist as they ran. There's another way out, but it's down below. The service tunnels, he called, voice tight with urgency. It's not pretty, but it's our best shot. They rounded a corner, and the thudding of heavy feet behind them grew louder. The creature wasn't far, its snarls almost palpable as it stalked them. Elena didn't even bother looking back. She could feel its presence, a constant, looming shadow of death. Another roar shattered the silence, and Elena's heart jumped into her throat. She could hear the other creatures closing in from different directions, cutting off their escape route. "Get down!" Morgan shouted. Elena didn't question it. She dropped to the ground as Morgan shoved her down, pulling her into a tight alcove by the wall. She could hear the scrape of claws on metal, the guttural growl of the creature sniffing the air, drawing closer. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps. Her pulse raced, and the only sound in her ears was the rhythmic pounding of her own heart. She couldn't think. She couldn't focus. She could only wait. The seconds stretched into eternity as she lay there, motionless. She could hear the creature's breath, slow, deliberate, as it circled them. A moment later, the creature's footfalls grew distant, its roars fading into the silence. Elena felt Morgan's hand on her arm, gently tugging her to her feet. "Now," he whispered, pulling her into the shadows. They moved quickly, slipping into the narrow service tunnel just ahead. The space was cramped, barely enough room for them to squeeze through. Elena's shoulder scraped against the walls as they hurried forward. It was dark, suffocating, and the air was damp with mildew and the heavy scent of rust. "You've got any more of those grenades?" Morgan asked, his voice barely audible. Elena's fingers twitched instinctively toward her gear, but her pouch was empty. "Out," she replied, breathless. "Great. We'll have to get creative then," Morgan muttered under his breath. They moved deeper into the bowels of the facility. Every few feet, the passage narrowed further until they were almost crawling on hands and knees. The walls seemed to pulse around them, the faint hum of the facility's dying systems vibrating beneath their skin. Elena had no illusions about their situation. The creatures were closing in. The architect wasn't just some mad scientist. He was orchestrating all of this, pulling strings from the shadows, and she knew that whatever twisted plan he had, it was far from over. They hadn't just unleashed the creatures. They had triggered something bigger, something more dangerous. The sound of claws scraping the walls above them cut through the stillness of the tunnel. Elena's heart skipped. They had to keep moving, had to outrun them. The tunnel ahead forked into two paths, one going deeper into the complex and the other spiraling up toward the surface. Morgan didn't hesitate. He chose the one leading upward. "I know a way out," he said, urgency in his voice. "It's a service exit near the east wing. We'll be close to the surface." Elena nodded, though she couldn't shake the dread that gnawed at her gut. They couldn't outrun the creatures forever. They had to destroy the source, the architect. But to do that, they needed more than just escape. They needed a plan. As they pushed forward, Elena couldn't help but think about the words the architect had said earlier. "The future of your species, a new dawn of life." What had that meant? What kind of future had they been creating down here? And more importantly, who else was involved in this twisted experiment? The answers were somewhere ahead, somewhere beyond. The metal walls and crumbling systems. But first they had to survive. Chapter 9. The Last Line. The tunnel grew narrower as they ascended, the air heavier with each passing moment. Elena's breath felt labored, her chest tight with exhaustion. They'd been running for what felt like hours, ducking into every shadow, avoiding the creatures that relentlessly hunted them. But no matter how fast they moved, the sense of inevitability hung over her like a dark cloud. "We're close," Morgan said, his voice gruff but steady as he turned to look back at her. Another couple of turns, and we'll be at the exit. Elena nodded, though the tightness in her stomach didn't ease. There was no guarantee that this exit would actually lead them to freedom. The facility was vast, a maze of steel and concrete. And even if they made it to the surface, there was still the matter of them, the creatures, the architect, and the horror they had unleashed. There was no real escape until this nightmare was over. The silence in the tunnel was deafening. The faint hum of machinery was still present, but it felt more distant now, as though the whole facility was slowly shutting down. She wondered if it was because of the shutdown she had triggered in the control room, or if it was simply the inevitable decay of something that had long outlived its purpose. "I don't like this," she muttered under her breath. "What?" Morgan's voice came from up ahead, sharp with concern. "It's too quiet," Elena answered, eyes scanning the darkness around them. The silence was oppressive. It was too still, too calm. They hadn't encountered any creatures in the last several minutes, which only made her feel more on edge. Something was coming. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Morgan slowed his pace, his hand tightening around the weapon he'd been clutching since the beginning. "Stay sharp," he muttered. "We're not out of the woods yet." They continued onward, creeping, through the winding, claustrophobic tunnel until, finally, the faint glint of light filtered through the cracks in the concrete ahead. The exit was close, just a few more steps, a few more breaths, and they would be out. But just as Elena was about to break into a run, a loud bang echoed through the tunnel. The walls shook violently, throwing her off balance. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall, heart hammering in her chest. The noise continued, a chaotic series of crashes, as if something huge was tearing through the very structure of the facility. "Move!" Morgan shouted, his hand gripping her arm with terrifying strength. "Now!" They ran. Elena could barely keep up, as the ground trembled beneath them, and the very walls seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. The tunnel ahead was crumbling. The ceiling began to crack and fall, chunks of concrete breaking off, blocking their path. The facility was collapsing, and the creatures, those monstrous hybrids, had finally broken through. "Shit!" Morgan gritted through clenched teeth. He was looking ahead, scanning for any way out, any escape. "There's no way around it." Elena said, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to push forward, keep moving." Morgan glanced behind them, his eyes narrowing. "I've got a bad feeling about this." Just as he said it, a new sound echoed through the tunnel, a deep, guttural growl, the unmistakable sound of something massive approaching. The creature had found them. Without another word, Morgan pulled Elena toward the side of the tunnel, where the shadows were deepest. It was a futile effort, but there was no other choice. They couldn't outrun the thing. They couldn't outfight it. The growl intensified, and then darkness. The creature appeared from the shadows, massive, its skin a tangle of muscle and scarred tissue, glowing eyes piercing through the dim light. It was the leader, the apex predator, and it was on them in an instant. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the creature lunged toward them, its claws extended like knives. She barely had time to raise her weapon, firing a burst straight at its chest. The creature staggered back for a second, but its massive form was barely slowed. It snarled, its lips curling back to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth, and lunged again. Morgan shoved Elena to the side, putting himself between her and the beast. He fired 2 quick shots, hitting the creature in the side, but it was like trying to stop a tank with a slingshot. The creature roared, pushing Morgan aside like he was nothing more than a rag doll. Elena's eyes widened as Morgan slammed into the wall, crumpling to the ground. Blood poured from a gash on his head, and for a moment he didn't move. "No!" Elena screamed, her heart crashing in her chest. She was out of options. Her weapon was almost out of ammunition. There was no escape, no way to fight this thing. But then, as if on instinct, she grabbed one of the grenades from her vest, one of the last remaining pieces of her gear, and pulled the pin. It felt like time slowed to a crawl as she hurled it toward the creature. The grenade bounced off the ground and rolled right under the creature's massive feet. For a split second, the beast hesitated, its glowing eyes flickering with confusion. Then the explosion erupted. The world around Elena was engulfed in blinding light and a deafening sound. The force of the blast knocked her off her feet, throwing her into the far wall. Pain shot through her head and she gasped for breath, disoriented. The tunnel was filled with smoke and dust, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than anything else. Elena's ears rang and her vision blurred. She could barely focus on the haze in front of her. "Morgan!" she shouted, pushing herself to her knees. Through the smoke, she saw the hulking form of the creature crumpled on the ground. Still, its glowing eyes now dim and lifeless. The explosion had taken it down, but it had cost them everything. Elena's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she stumbled toward Morgan. He was alive, but barely. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, his face pale and covered in sweat. "I've got you," Elena said, her voice hoarse as she pulled him into a sitting position, supporting him against the wall. She could feel the weight of the moment settling over her. They had survived, barely, but the war was far from over. The architect was still out there, and whatever he had planned wasn't over. They had only bought themselves a little more time, but for now, they were alive. For now, that was enough. Chapter 10. Echoes of the architect. Elena's hands shook as she adjusted Morgan against the wall. His blood was still oozing from the gash on his head, but at least he was breathing, slowly, steadily. She'd seen enough battle to know that those moments between life and death could change in the blink of an eye. The explosion had taken down the creature, but she could feel the weight of what had happened, the silence left in its wake. The tunnel was eerily quiet now, save for the distant hum of malfunctioning systems and the occasional drip of water echoing through the walls. Elena's mind raced as she searched the shadows for any signs of movement. They weren't out of danger yet. Far from it. "Hey," she said softly, placing a hand on Morgan's shoulder. He didn't respond at first, his head lolling back against the wall. "Morgan, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, his pupils dilated and unfocused. But when he saw her, there was a flicker of recognition, though it was quickly clouded by exhaustion. "Damn. That was close," he muttered, his voice raspy. He coughed, grimacing as pain flared from his side. Elena could see the strain in his face, the toll of the injuries. "I can't carry you out of here," she said, the words feeling colder than she intended. "But I'm not leaving you." Morgan blinked, trying to focus on her. "You don't have a choice. If the architect—" He broke off with a harsh cough, wincing. "If he's still alive, if that thing is still pulling strings, we need to finish this. We need to stop him." Elena's stomach twisted at the thought of the architect, his sickening voice echoing in her mind. His cruel words had stayed with her. "You think you've won? You've only just begun to understand what you've unleashed." She looked down the tunnel, her mind already mapping out their next move. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Every second counted. "We'll take him down," Elena said, her voice hard with resolve. "But we can't do it from here. We need to move." Morgan grunted, slowly pushing himself up. He was clearly struggling to stay conscious, but his will to fight was stronger than his pain. "We need to find the central control room. If we can get into the core systems, we can shut it all down. The whole facility. The creatures, the experiments, all of it." "You know where it is?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. If there was one thing Morgan had, it was knowledge of this facility, whether he liked it or not. "I do," he said, eyes narrowing. "I've been here long enough to learn every route, every escape, and every system, but getting there won't be easy. The last time I checked, the main control center was locked down tighter than anything else. There's no way we're getting in without a fight." Elena nodded. She didn't expect anything else. "And if the architect is still alive, he's got to be in there." Morgan's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Exactly." She extended a hand to him, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. The action felt like a brief moment of solidarity in the chaos. They were in this together, for better or worse. The sound of distant footsteps broke their moment of silence, and Elena's senses snapped back into high gear. She raised her weapon, but Morgan's hand shot out, stopping her. Not yet. He whispered, his voice filled with urgency. It's too soon. The creatures are still a distance away. We need to move fast, but quietly. Elena gave a terse nod and followed his lead, taking slow, measured steps as they made their way deeper into the tunnel. Each step felt heavier than the last. The weight of everything they had seen, the blood, the loss, the relentless nightmare that still pursued them, every part of it pressed down on her. As they reached a narrow intersection in the tunnel, Elena glanced down at Morgan, seeing the strain in his eyes. He was struggling to keep up, but he was still moving, still fighting. "Hang on," she said. "We're almost there." "Yeah," Morgan's voice trailed off as he glanced over his shoulder. The distant sound of claws scraping against metal grew louder. "You've got a lot more faith than I do." Elena gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay focused. There was no time for doubt. Not now. They reached a larger chamber at the end of the tunnel, a cold, sterile space filled with the faint hum of machinery. The walls were lined with thick cables and blinking control panels, but everything looked abandoned, neglected. This place had once been the heart of operations, and now it felt like a graveyard. "We're close," Morgan muttered, moving toward a rusted door at the far side of the chamber. The control room should be just beyond this, but before they could reach it, the sound of something moving in the shadows reached them. A low, haunting growl that set the hairs on the back of Elena's neck standing on end. "No!" Morgan hissed, looking around wildly. "They've found us!" The growl became a snarl, and then, as if on cue, the first creature emerged from the darkness. A massive hybrid, its glowing eyes narrowing in on them. And behind it, more shapes appeared, slithering from the darkness, their twisted forms glowing faintly in the low light. Elena's heart pounded in her chest and her finger tightened on the trigger. "We fight or we die," Morgan nodded, his hand going to his sidearm as he moved to the edge of the chamber, crouching low. They were surrounded, the creatures closing in from all sides. Elena scanned the room, searching for an escape, but the walls were closing in, the sounds of the beasts growing louder. There was only one option. Elena turned to Morgan, her eyes fierce with determination. "We take them out, and we get to that control room." Morgan gave her a grim nod. "Let's make to count." The first creature lunged. Chapter 11. The Final Stand. The creature's roar echoed through the chamber, sending a chill down Elena's spine. It was monstrous, twisted, with jagged teeth that looked like they could tear through steel. Its glowing eyes locked onto her, and its claws scraped against the metal floor, sending sparks flying. "Elena!" Morgan shouted, snapping her back to reality. Without a second thought, she raised her weapon and fired. The burst of gunfire shattered the air, striking the creature in the shoulder. It staggered back but didn't go down. It was tough, too. Tough. They needed more than bullets to take it down. Morgan opened fire as well, his shots ricocheting off the creature's thick hide. Elena could see the impact, but it wasn't enough. The creature advanced again, moving faster than she had anticipated. Its claws slashed through the air, aiming for Morgan. "Move!" Elena shouted, pulling Morgan out of the way just as the creature's claws narrowly missed his face. The other hybrids were closing in now, more of them, appearing from the shadows like a nightmare come to life. Their twisted forms moved in synchrony, their eyes glowing with malice. They weren't just hunting, they were methodical, almost intelligent in their movements. "Elena, we need to move." Morgan gritted through his teeth, struggling to keep his balance as he pushed himself to his feet. The chamber was too open. They had no cover and nowhere to retreat to. The creatures had them cornered. But Elena refused to let fear consume her. She knew that if they didn't act now, they'd be overwhelmed. The first creature lunged again, but this time Elena was ready. She threw herself to the side, narrowly dodging its attack. As it missed, she aimed for its exposed side, hitting it square in the ribs. The creature screamed, a horrible sound that echoed off the walls, but it didn't stop. It just kept coming. "Keep firing," Elena shouted to Morgan. Morgan didn't need any more encouragement. His gun blazed in the dim light, his shots ringing. out one after another. The creatures shrieked, but the bullets barely slowed them down. It was like they were made of something otherworldly, something designed to resist conventional weapons. One of the hybrids, larger than the rest, charged straight for Elena. She didn't have time to aim, so she did the only thing she could think of. She dropped her gun and grabbed a metal rod from a nearby control panel. With a quick swing, she drove it into the creature's eye. It howled in agony, the sound so terrible Elena felt it in her bones. But it wasn't enough. The creature didn't go down. It was still coming. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Morgan!" she shouted. Morgan was already ahead of her, moving with surprising speed despite his injuries. He grabbed a large piece of debris from the ground. What looked like part of a broken machine, and swung it at the creature, smashing it across the skull. The hybrid staggered, but again it didn't stop. "Get to the door," Morgan yelled, backing toward the rusted exit. "It's our only chance." Elena hesitated for a split second, her eyes scanning the room. The hybrids were relentless, but they couldn't stop her now. She had come too far, survived too much. She couldn't let them die here. She grabbed her weapon again, unloading the last of her ammo into the advancing creatures. The shots barely slowed them, but it gave her enough time. Just enough time. She turned and sprinted for the exit, her legs burning with every step. The metal door was only a few feet away now, and she could hear the creatures following her, closer with each passing second. She reached for the handle and yanked it open, but it was stuck in place. "No," she hissed, her heart leaping into her throat. She pulled harder, trying to force it open. Behind her, she could hear the creature's claws scraping on the floor as they closed in. Time was running out. "Push." Morgan's voice cracked through the chaos. He was right behind her, his breathing labored. Elena slammed her shoulder into the door, the metal creaking under the force of her weight. She felt it budge slightly, then stop. The creatures were nearly on top of them now, their growls so loud it rattled her teeth. One last shove. The door gave way. They both stumbled through, and Elena slammed it shut behind them just as the first hybrid reached the threshold. The creature's claws scraped against the metal door, but it didn't get through. For a moment, all there was silence, panting, breathing, and the sound of their own hearts beating like war drums. Elena turned to Morgan, her chest heaving. His face was pale, covered in dirt and blood, but he was still standing, still fighting. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice hoarse. Elena nodded, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "We have to get to the control room. If we're going to stop the architect, it has to be now." Morgan took a slow breath and nodded. "I know the way. It's not far. But the next part, it won't be easy. I'm not backing down," Elena said, her voice hard with resolve. She wasn't going to stop until the architect paid for what he had done, for the lives lost, for the nightmares that still hunted them. They made their way through the corridors quickly, the sounds of the creatures still echoing behind them. But as they neared the control room, the environment changed. The walls were cleaner, more polished, and the air grew thick with tension. Morgan paused in front of a security door, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. He reached for a keypad on the wall, swiping a card that Elena hadn't seen him carry. There was a beep, then a click, and the door slid open with a hiss. "This is it," he said, stepping through first. Elena followed him into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The control room was vast, filled with banks of screens and monitors. In the center, a large holographic map of the facility hung suspended in the air, outlining every room, every hallway, and every escape route. "This is it. This is how we end it," Morgan said, moving toward the control panel at the center of the room. Elena's eyes scanned the map, already calculating their next move. The architect had to be here somewhere deep in the system. They didn't have much time. The silence in the control room was broken by a low voice, a voice that echoed through the speakers, cold and full of malice. "You think you've won?" The architect's voice sent a shiver down Elena's spine. "You've only just begun to understand the true power I've unlocked. The future isn't for you to decide. Elena's blood ran cold. The architect was watching them, and he wasn't done yet. Chapter 12. The Architect's Game. The architect's voice seemed to reverberate from every corner of the control room, cold and mocking. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as the words sank in. You think you've won? His voice crackled, with static, but there was no mistaking the amusement in it. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. Elena's fingers tightened around the grip of her weapon, her pulse racing. She glanced at Morgan, who was hunched over the control panel, typing frantically. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes flicking across the myriad screens that filled the room. His brow furrowed in concentration, but there was something in his posture that suggested uncertainty. We can't let him play us, Elena muttered under her breath, her mind spinning with all the possibilities of what the architect might be setting up. We're running out of time, Morgan said, his voice low. I'm almost through to the core system, but if he's got control of everything in here— He has, Elena said, cutting him off. He's been controlling this place from the start. We need to shut it all down, now. Morgan's hands shook slightly as he punched in a command, and for a brief moment the holographic map flickered. Elena's eyes darted to the screen. Something was wrong. The map wasn't showing just the layout of the facility anymore. It was alive, shifting, changing, reconfiguring in real time. He's got control over the entire system, Morgan growled, frustration creeping into his voice. We're not going to get through unless we take him down first. Elena's gut twisted. If we can't access the systems, there's no way to stop the creatures, no way to stop the architect. A low hum began to fill the room, and a series of alarms started to blare in the distance, signaling a new phase of the architect's plan. Elena turned sharply, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of an immediate threat. But everything seemed strangely still. Too still. Then a sudden movement caught her eye. A shape flickered across one of the monitors. Her breath caught in her throat. They're coming, Elena whispered, her voice tight. The walls surrounding them began to vibrate with a strange, almost mechanical pulse. Then, without warning, the room plunged into darkness. The low hum that had filled the air turned into a deafening roar as power flickered back on, this time in flashes, like the system itself was struggling to stay alive. What the hell? Morgan cursed, slamming his hand on the console. Damn it, no, he's overriding the power grid. The screens around them shifted, and now, instead of maps and controls, they were filled with static, flickering images that barely made sense. And then, there he was, the architect's face displayed on every screen, his cold, calculating eyes staring back at them, illuminated in a pale, eerie light. You can't escape, Lieutenant. His voice oozed with smug satisfaction. It's already too late. The creatures have already spread. You won't be able to stop them now. Elena gritted her teeth. We'll see about that. She didn't hesitate. She turned toward Morgan, who was still trying to regain control of the panel, his hands flying over the buttons. Keep working, Elena ordered, her voice firm. I'll hold him off. Morgan barely nodded, his eyes locked on the screens as the architect's face twisted with a chilling grin. We're not done yet, Elena muttered, already moving toward the door. But as soon as she moved, the lights flickered again, and the room trembled beneath her feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the architect's doing. She gripped the weapon tighter as the ground beneath her feet cracked, revealing a deep pit. The floor buckled, sending debris flying. Elena dove to the side, narrowly missing the jagged edges of the split floor. The architect's face twisted into something almost triumphant. This is only the beginning. You've walked right into my trap. Suddenly, the screens exploded with chaos. Images of creatures emerging from the dark corridors of the facility, clawing their way toward the control room. Their grotesque bodies twisted and malformed, half human, half alien. Elena's stomach churned as she realized the magnitude of what they were facing. There was no longer a simple mission. There was nothing left but survival. Elena. Morgan shouted from across the room, his voice panicked. She turned to see him desperately trying to shut down the facility's power grid, but the machines around him were glitching, out of his control. The architect's influence had spread too deep. The walls around them began to buckle, and then, the creatures, they were here. The first emerged from a darkened hallway, its elongated limbs crawling, its pale skin glistening with sweat and its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It screeched, a sound that pierced the air, reverberating off the walls like 1,000 knives scraping against metal. "Elena!" Morgan shouted again, his voice full of panic. He ran toward her, his hand outstretched. "We need to move now." But as the door to the control room slid open with a hiss, more of the creatures flooded in, rushing forward like a horde of demons unleashed from hell. "Get to the emergency exit," Elena screamed, shoving Morgan toward a hallway that led to the facility's last remaining escape route. She turned to face the oncoming tide of monsters, her weapon raised, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. "We can't hold them off forever," Morgan shouted. "I know," Elena said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "But we're going to make it. We're not dying here." The first creature lunged at her, and with a quick movement she fired, hitting it square in the chest. It staggered back, but more were coming, closer, faster. "Move!" Elena shouted to Morgan as she unloaded another burst of ammo into the creatures advancing on them. They ran, down the long, narrow corridors. Elena's pulse raced as she pushed herself harder, the weight of the mission pressing down on her. She could hear the creatures' claws scraping against the walls, their hungry growls growing louder with each step. She didn't dare look back. Ahead of them, the emergency exit was close, just a few more steps. But the sound of an explosion shook the entire facility. The walls groaned under the pressure, and the lights flickered, then went out again. The architect's voice filled the air once more. "You'll never escape. This place is my legacy. You cannot fight me." Elena's hands clenched into fists as she fought for every breath. "Watch us." With one final push, they reached the exit. Elena grabbed the door handle, throwing it open just as the creatures reached them. And for the first time since all this madness began, Elena allowed herself one single, fleeting thought. Maybe they would survive, maybe not. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Chapter 13. Through the fire, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang, and for a moment, all Elena could hear was the heavy pounding of her own heart. Her breath came in short, jagged bursts as she leaned against the cold steel of the exit door, the echoes of the creature's claws scraping against the wall still lingering in her ears. "Are you okay?" Morgan's voice was strained, his breathing ragged. He was leaning against the opposite wall, clutching his side as if the effort of running had taken more of a toll on him than he'd let on. Elena didn't answer immediately. She was still processing everything. The chaos, the adrenaline, the overwhelming weight of it all. They had barely escaped the control room, and yet the feeling that they were far from out of danger gnawed at her insides. "We need to keep moving," Elena said finally, her voice sharp with purpose. "There's no way the architect is going to let us go that easily." Morgan nodded, his jaw tight. His face was pale, but he pushed himself off the wall and stood straighter. "Right. We need to make it to the central reactor. If we can destroy the core, the entire facility will shut down." Elena's mind raced as she processed his words. The central reactor. They needed to get to it before the creatures overwhelmed them. It was the last chance to stop the architect and end this nightmare. "Lead the way," Elena said, her tone firm. Morgan nodded again, pushing himself into motion. They moved down the darkened hallway, their footsteps muffled on the thick metal flooring. The facility felt like a labyrinth. Every turn, every hallway, every junction was a reminder that they were deep within enemy territory. Elena's hand never left the grip of her weapon, her senses on high alert. They passed through dark corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. Every so often they would hear the distant shrieks of the creatures as they hunted for prey, but none of them appeared in the immediate vicinity. It was as though the architect had other plans for them, playing a game they had no say in. The silence that followed them felt oppressive, as if the entire facility were holding its breath, waiting for something. The oppressive tension that hung. The air was unbearable. "What's the plan when we get to the reactor?" Elena asked, breaking the silence between them. She wanted to be prepared. No matter what happened, they couldn't afford any surprises now. Morgan shot her a look, his face shadowed in the dim light. "We get to the control room in the reactor, override the system, and manually trigger the meltdown. It's the only way to guarantee that the architect can't bring it back online. But it's not going to be easy. It's a fortified position." "I expected nothing less," Elena replied, her lips curling into a grim smile. Morgan's eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible moment of humor, but then his face hardened again. They didn't have time for distractions. They reached another set of doors, this time reinforced with thick steel. These doors were different. They weren't just there to keep people in. They were designed to keep things out. Elena could almost feel the weight of them, the final barrier between her and whatever lay inside the reactor core. "Here we are," Morgan said quietly, moving toward the control panel next to the door. He swiped his ID card and entered a code into the terminal. The door groaned before slowly sliding open, revealing the inner sanctum of the reactor room. The first thing that hit Elena was the heat. The temperature inside was sweltering, the air thick with the hum of machinery working at full capacity. She could feel the heat radiating from the reactor's core, and the steady buzz of the energy flowing through the facility's veins was almost oppressive. There were no guards, no alarms, just the hum of the reactor, and then the unmistakable voice of the architect crackled through the intercom system. "You think you've won?" His voice was impossibly calm, too smooth, as though everything was going exactly according to his design. "You are too late. The creatures are already everywhere. The facility is under my control. Even if you manage to reach the reactor, it's already too late. The system will keep running. You'll die in here just like all the others." Morgan's jaw clenched, but his hands didn't falter as he moved toward the control panel. "He's trying to break us. Don't let it get to you." Elena nodded sharply. "Focus. We're this close." Morgan quickly worked through a series of commands, but the terminal kept blinking, glitching, rejecting his attempts. Sweat trickled down his forehead, his hands trembling from exhaustion and pain. "He's locked us out," Morgan muttered under his breath. "I can't get in." Elena's gaze flickered to the reactor's control room at the center of the facility. Through the thick glass, she could see the massive, swirling core, crackling with energy, an angry, pulsing heart of the entire operation. "We don't have much time," Elena said, glancing at the security cameras overhead. The architect was toying with them, dragging out their time and forcing them into desperation. She could sense it in the air, the cold calmness of the architect, as he watched them, as if they were nothing more than pieces in his game. Suddenly, the floor beneath them trembled. Elena's instincts kicked in and she whirled to face the door they had just entered. A high-pitched screech echoed through the facility, louder this time, closer. The creatures were here. They were coming. "We don't have time," Elena said, eyes narrowing with resolve. "We need to get to the core, now." Morgan nodded, his face a mask of determination despite the exhaustion weighing down on him. Together, they sprinted across the reactor room, their boots thudding against the metal floor. But just as they reached the central control station, a loud crash rang out from the far end of the room. One of the creatures, larger and more terrifying than any they had encountered, had burst through the reinforced doors. It howled, its elongated limbs reaching out for them with monstrous speed. Morgan stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in horror. "Elena, go!" he shouted. But Elena didn't need to be told twice. She spun around, diving for the control station, her fingers flying over the keys as the creature drew closer. It was now or never. She hit the button. The entire facility shook as alarms went off, warning lights flashing in bright red. The reactor's core started to overload. She could hear the angry whine of the system as the countdown began. Elena turned back just in time to see Morgan fall to the floor, struggling against the creature's grasp. "Morgan!" Elena screamed. But there was no time. The countdown was already at 5 seconds. She turned away, pushing forward as the reactor's core began to power down. The hum that had filled the room became a roar, a deafening surge of energy before the entire facility rattled violently. The architect's final words echoed in her mind. It's too late for you. The countdown hit 0. Chapter 14. Collapse. The world around Elena exploded in a flash of white-hot light. The reactor's core ignited with a deafening roar, its energy rippling outward in a pulse so powerful it threw Elena off her feet. The air crackled with the "kai" sound of rending metal, the facility's walls groaning as if they were alive, crying out in agony. For a moment, everything was chaos. The lights flickered and buzzed, and the ground trembled beneath Elena's feet as she scrambled to her hands and knees, gasping for breath. The shockwave from the reactor's meltdown surged through the building, shaking everything apart. She had only a split second to react as the room around her twisted and warped. "Morgan!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of destruction. Her eyes scanned the control room, desperate for any sign of him. The massive creature, the one she'd seen moments ago, had been thrown backward by the explosion. Its monstrous body was sprawled across the floor, twitching as its own body began to melt away under the effects of the overload. The fire in the reactor had done what bullets and blades could not, disintegrated the creature, and possibly, just possibly, had delivered them their chance at survival. But Morgan was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through Elena's veins. She pushed herself to her feet, the world still shaking around her. The walls were crumbling, debris falling from above as the reactor's meltdown began to tear apart the facility from the inside. A shrill, screeching alarm blared, signaling imminent collapse. "Morgan!" she cried again, her voice hoarse now, the air growing thick with smoke and dust. She ran toward the far corner of the room where she had last seen him. She found him lying on the ground, his body half buried under the wreckage of a collapsed wall. Blood was pooling around his head, staining the concrete a dark, sinister red. "Elena," Morgan whispered, barely able to lift his head as he reached for her with a trembling hand. Her heart squeezed in her chest. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she assessed his injuries. His face was pale, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. "You're going to be okay," Elena said, her voice shaking with panic, though she fought to keep it steady. "Just hold on, Morgan. We can still make it." Morgan gave her a faint, pained smile. "You did it. You stopped him." His voice trailed off into a ragged cough. The ground rumbled again, and Elena could feel the entire building beginning to fall apart around them. The architect's mocking voice rang in her ears, but there was something in it now. Something strange, almost as if it too were failing, cracking under the weight of its own creation. "Elena," Morgan gasped again, his grip on her arm tightening. "I need you to get out. Now. You have to survive." She shook her head vehemently, refusing to acknowledge the truth in his words. "We're not leaving you behind. We get out of here together." Morgan's grip weakened, his hand slipping from hers, but his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that burned through the fog of despair. "You have to." His words were strained, almost pleading. "The reactor, it's only a matter of time before everything comes down. If you stay, you'll never make it. You have to leave now." "No," Elena protested, her voice thick with emotion. She couldn't lose him like this. But she saw it in his eyes. He knew that this was the end, that the collapse of the facility had sealed their fate. There was no more time. "Go," he said again, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "For the mission, for everyone who's lost. You finish it." Tears stung Elena's eyes, but she wiped them away angrily, refusing to let them fall. "I'm not leaving you, Morgan. You have to," he whispered one last time, his eyes dimming. "You have to." The tremor in his voice, the weight of his words, finally broke through Elena's resistance. With a final, heart-wrenching look at him, she swallowed the lump in her throat. She stood up, forcing herself to take one step back, then another. She could feel his eyes on her as she turned toward the exit, her heart breaking with each step she took. The facility was falling apart. The floor buckled beneath her feet as she sprinted toward the door, debris crashing around her. She couldn't look back. She couldn't lose him. The final escape. The corridor outside the reactor room was in chaos. The walls were on fire, and the entire structure groaned under the weight of the facility's collapse. Sparks flew from overhead conduits. As the building fell apart, the very bones of the structure screaming as they fractured. Elena didn't care. She kept running, her boots pounding against the metal floor. She could hear the creatures behind her now, their shrieks echoing through the hallways, a horrific reminder that they weren't out of danger yet. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps as she turned another corner. The emergency exit was just ahead. She could see the flickering red light above the door, signaling that it was still active. She was so close. She could taste the air outside, the freedom just within reach, but the creatures were closing in fast, their monstrous figures filling the darkened hallways. There was no time to waste. Elena pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain in her side, the pounding in her head. She had to make it out. She had to. With one final burst of energy, she slammed her shoulder into the emergency door, throwing it open just as the first creature reached her. Its claws swiped at the air, but she was already through, slamming the door shut behind her. For a brief moment, everything was still. She was outside. The night air hit her like a cold wave, and Elena took a ragged breath, staring at the wreckage of the facility in the distance. She could hear the roar of the explosion behind her, the finality of it. The architect's empire was crumbling, and so were the creatures. She had done it. She had stopped him. But the cost was too much to bear. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind wash over her. The stars above were clear and distant, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself a moment of peace. For Morgan, for everyone. But the war wasn't over. The architect's legacy would live on in the shadows. She knew that now. Elena turned, taking one last look at the facility as it crumbled into nothingness. She would finish what she started, no matter the cost. Chapter 15. Aftermath. The cold night air bit at Elena's skin as she stood alone on the charred earth, staring back at the burning ruins of the facility. The distant roar of the explosion was still echoing, fading slowly into the night, but the silence that followed it was deafening. Her chest ached, not from physical injury, but from the heavy weight of loss. Morgan's face lingered in her mind, his last words to her, his hands reaching out with that desperate, almost pleading grip. You have to survive. The pain of losing him was like a wound that wouldn't heal. But the mission had been completed. The architect was gone. The creatures were destroyed. The nightmare was over. And yet, as she stood there, her eyes locked on the twisted wreckage of the facility, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over. She glanced down at the rifle slung over her shoulder, her hands trembling, slightly as they ran over the cold metal. It felt wrong, empty now, like there was nothing left to fight, no more enemies to hunt, no more reasons to keep going. But she had to keep going. For Morgan, for the others. A low, grinding noise reached her ears, pulling her from her reverie. She whipped around, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was no immediate danger, no creature charging at her. Instead, the source of the noise was a small, military-grade transport vehicle, pulling up from the haze of smoke and dust that surrounded the facility. Elena narrowed her eyes, unsure of what to expect. The vehicle's engine sputtered and died as it came to a halt. The door opened with a hiss, and two figures stepped out. The first was tall, with a stern, weathered face that looked familiar, though Elena couldn't immediately place him. The second, much younger, had a sharp gaze, a sense of urgency in his movements. The man who stepped forward first addressed her directly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that only years of experience could breed. "Lieutenant Elena Hayes," he asked, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that felt almost clinical. Elena nodded slowly, her voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. That's me. We're with command, the man said, his gaze not softening. We were sent to extract survivors. Elena blinked. Survivors? She scanned the landscape around her. There was nothing, no sign of anyone. The facility was destroyed. She was the only one standing in the aftermath. Survivors, she repeated, her voice barely, more than a whisper. The man's eyes shifted slightly, and he glanced back at the young soldier who stood beside him. The younger man opened a small tablet and began to read from it, his eyes darting across the screen before he looked back up at Elena. There were no survivors in the facility, Lieutenant. But the mission you completed? It's only part of something larger. Elena's mind raced. She hadn't completed the mission to complete it. She had done it to survive, to stop the architect, to end the terror. What was he talking about? Larger, Elena asked, her brow furrowing. The older man stepped forward, his face serious. The architect was just one part of a much bigger project. His research into human-alien hybridization wasn't isolated. He wasn't working alone. His work was just one cog in a machine, an experimental project by multiple factions spanning continents. The creatures? They're just the beginning. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean, just the beginning? There are others like him. Organizations, governments, rogue factions. They've been building a network of hybridized soldiers, weapons, and technology. This facility, it was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. We've been tracking similar operations across the globe. The architect's demise is a victory, yes, but only one battle. There's more to fight. Elena's world seemed to tilt. She had just fought through hell to bring down the architect's twisted empire. And now she was hearing that this was only the start. Her chest tightened, a familiar sense of dread creeping in. Why didn't you tell me this before? She demanded, her voice shaky with frustration. Why send me to a facility with no knowledge of what I was up against? The older man's gaze hardened. We didn't have enough intel. The architect's operation was classified and we only received word about it recently. The last thing we needed was for you to go in blind and compromise the operation. Elena's breath hitched, her hands clenched into fists. I was sent in to die. The younger man stepped forward, his expression apologetic. We didn't know it would escalate like this. We didn't know he was that far along. Elena shook her head, disbelief flashing in her eyes. I watched everything fall apart. I fought those things. I watched people die. And now you tell me this? The older man sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on. Listen, Lieutenant, we understand how you feel, but now, more than ever, we need you. The world needs you. What you've done has stopped one piece of this nightmare, but we need you to help us stop the rest of it. The words stung, but there was a small spark of something inside her. Anger, yes, but something else too. Responsibility. She hadn't finished the fight. The architect may have been a major player, but the game was far from over. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about ending it. For good. I've lost too much, Elena muttered, her voice hoarse, her eyes on the ground. Morgan, I couldn't save him. The older man nodded solemnly, his voice softer now. I know, but his sacrifice wasn't in vain. What you've done here, it buys us time, but we need your help to go after the others. We can't do it without you. Elena stood still for a long moment, her heart still heavy with grief, but she knew what needed to be done. Morgan's death, everyone's death, had to mean something. She couldn't just walk away from this. Finally, she looked up, her eyes hardening with resolve. She met the older man's gaze and nodded. Then let's finish this, she said, her voice steady, cold. For them, the younger soldier gave a quick nod, and the older man placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll head back to base. You'll be briefed on the next steps. You've done the hard part. But now the real war begins. Elena turned toward the vehicle, her mind already shifting into the next phase. As she climbed into the back seat, the enormity of what was still ahead hit her. The architect was just the beginning, but Elena Hayes had never been one to back down from a fight. And this fight? It wasn't over, not yet. Chapter 16. A New Mission. The hum of the military transport vehicle was almost soothing as Elena sat in the back, staring out the small, dust-streaked window. The sky above was dimming with the first blush of dawn, but it offered no comfort. The weight of what she had learned over the past few hours weighed heavy on her shoulders. The world was bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The facility had been destroyed. The architect was gone. But that wasn't the end. Not even close. Elena's fingers tightened around the rifle slung across her lap, the cold metal a reminder of everything she had fought through. But now, as they drove away from the charred ruins, the emptiness of her victory gnawed at her. The architect's demise had come at such a high price. She had lost so much already. Morgan, the other soldiers, the lives that had been claimed by the creatures. And for what? To buy them time. To fight a war that was still very much in its infancy? The soldier beside her, the one who had spoken to her earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She could feel his gaze on her, but she didn't acknowledge it. He had seen it in her eyes, her resistance, her anger. He knew she wasn't just going to walk into the next mission without pushing for answers. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said, his voice hesitant. "I know it's a lot to take in, but we need you to understand the bigger picture." Elena turned to face him, her eyes narrowed. "I've seen enough to understand. The architect wasn't working alone. There are others, organizations, out. They're doing the same thing. More hybrids, more experiments. What are we supposed to do? Hunt them down one by one?" The soldier shifted, glancing nervously at the older man in the front seat. He had stayed silent so far, his eyes focused on the road ahead. But now he spoke up. "It's more complicated than that, Elena," he said, his voice steady but laced, with the fatigue of someone who had seen too much. "The hybrid project, the experiments, they're part of a larger global network. What we're facing is a war that's been brewing for decades. The architect was just a small part of a bigger puzzle. The people behind this, they're well-funded, well-organized. Some have political power, others have military backing. They're all working toward one goal: control." Elena's jaw clenched. "Control of what? The hybrids, or something worse?" The older man glanced at her briefly. "Both. The hybrids are a weapon, yes, but their true purpose goes beyond just creating super soldiers. These experiments, they've been trying to create an army of unyielding soldiers capable of taking on governments, civilians, anyone who stands in their way. They believe humanity is fragile and needs to be restructured. They want to establish a new order, one where they have ultimate control." Elena shook her head, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what she was hearing. "You're telling me there are people out there who want to start a war that involves hybrids, monsters like the ones I fought?" The soldier nodded grimly. "That's exactly it, and they've been gathering power for years. The architect's facility was just one of many, all with different objectives, all part of a much larger secretive initiative." Elena's thoughts spun as she tried to piece it all together. A new world order. It sounded insane, yet everything she had seen in the past weeks had proven that insanity was a very real thing. "What does that mean for me?" she asked, her voice cold but steady. "What do you want me to do?" The older man met her eyes in the rearview mirror, his gaze unwavering. "We need you to lead the next phase of this operation, Lieutenant. We need you to help us take down the remaining factions. The people behind this, they'll stop at nothing to achieve their goals. But you're the key to stopping them. You know the hybrid program inside and out. You've been in the field. You've seen the devastation they can cause." Elena sat back in her seat, staring ahead at the endless stretch of road. There was a heaviness in her chest, a part of her that still wanted to walk away, to find peace after everything she'd been through. But she knew that was a fantasy. She wasn't going to get peace. "Not yet. I'm not a leader," she muttered under her breath. "I'm just a soldier." "You've led already," the older man said quietly. "You brought down the architect's operation. That's more than most could ever achieve. You don't have to be a politician or a general. You just need to keep doing what you've always Done. Fighting to survive. Elena didn't respond. She didn't know what to say. All the words she could think of felt hollow. She had survived, yes, but survival wasn't enough anymore. She wanted answers. She wanted justice, and she would get it for Morgan. For the others who had been lost along the way, where are we going? She finally asked, her voice low but steady. The older man gave her a grim look. We've pinpointed the location of another facility. This one's much more dangerous. It's not just a lab. It's a full-scale military operation. We'll need to infiltrate, gather intel, and neutralize the threat before they expand further. Elena clenched her fists. What's the plan? The man met her eyes in the rearview mirror again, his expression unreadable. You're the plan. She stared at him, unsure if that was an insult or a compliment. Either way, it didn't matter. She was already in this. There was no turning back now. The road stretched on, the transport vehicle bouncing over the rugged terrain as it sped toward its next destination. The war was far from over. Chapter 17. Into the fire. The days blurred into one another as Elena and her team made their way toward the next target, an underground compound located deep within a remote mountain range. The intel they'd received indicated that this facility was larger and more fortified than the last one. The hybrid experiments there were rumored to be even more advanced, possibly reaching the final stages of development. Elena couldn't shake the images of the previous battle. The grotesque creatures, the bloodshed, the screams. And Morgan. She had to push those thoughts aside. There was no room for grief. Not yet. The mission came first. But that didn't make it any easier. The transport vehicle rattled over rough terrain, the thrum of the engine the only sound breaking the heavy silence inside. Elena stared out the window, her fingers absently tracing the surface of her rifle. Her eyes were dark, haunted. She hadn't slept much since leaving the ruins of the architect's facility. But there was no time for sleep. They had a mission, a war to stop. The older man in the front seat, Colonel Park, had given her little more than briefings and updates, his face a mask of professionalism. The younger soldier, Lieutenant Carter, had attempted to make small talk here and there, but it was always awkward, his attempts at conversation falling flat under Elena's cold demeanor. They knew what she was carrying inside, and they knew what they needed from her. As the transport veered around another mountain bend, Elena's gaze sharpened. The landscape was shifting, the rough, wild land giving way to something more barren. This was the end of civilization, the place where only the most dangerous people would hide. We're close. Colonel Park's voice broke the silence, calm but stern. Elena gave a curt nod. Lieutenant Carter leaned forward from the passenger seat, tapping a series of coordinates into his tablet. The satellite recon shows no movement inside the compound yet, but they'll be expecting us soon. We have less than 12 hours before they activate their defenses. Elena's grip on her rifle tightened. We'll hit them hard and fast. We can't afford any mistakes this time. Park turned to her, his eyes flickering with an approving glance. That's what we expect from you, Lieutenant. You've been through hell already. Now it's time to finish this. As they neared the compound's location, Elena felt a shift in the air. The gravity of what lay ahead seemed to settle over her, weighing her down. The closer they got, the more she could feel the threat looming. The very nature of the place made her skin crawl, a base hidden beneath the mountains, built to withstand the harshest of assaults, harboring a deadly new breed of soldier. The road came to an abrupt end. The transport slowed as it neared the entrance to a tunnel, one hidden from satellite scans by the sheer expanse of rock. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed the compound whole. Get ready, Park said, unstrapping his harness and reaching for his gear. We're about to go dark. No more communications. We move in under the cover of night. Elena's heart was pounding now, the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. She adjusted her helmet, checked her sidearm, and then stood, grabbing her pack. She had to stay sharp. Every instinct she had honed through the chaos of the past days told her that this was going to be their hardest fight yet. The transport rumbled into the tunnel, the sound of the engine echoing off the walls. and the world outside turned black as pitch. The only light came from the dim glow of the vehicle's headlights, reflecting off the wet rocks lining the path. It was the perfect cover, but it also meant they were stepping into the heart of enemy territory, where every shadow could hide a threat. When the vehicle came to a halt, the soldiers disembarked quickly, moving as one cohesive unit. Elena, always the first out, surveyed their surroundings. The air was cold and thin. The mountain was silent, but there was something about it that felt wrong. "Let's move," Elena said, her voice sharp. She led the way, her boots crunching against the rocky ground as the rest of the team followed her lead. They didn't speak much. There was no need for words when the mission was clear. Their goal was simple: breach the compound, neutralize the threat, and gather as much intel as possible. But the silence felt suffocating. Elena's mind was racing, the weight of what they were about to do hanging heavy on her shoulders. The entrance to the compound was well hidden, just a small, unassuming door disguised as part of the mountain's rock face. But Elena knew better. She could feel the presence of the enemy within, just beyond that door, waiting. Park motioned for the team to stop. He turned to Elena. "You're leading this one. The layout of the compound is unknown, but we'll have to split up once we're inside. You're the one who knows how to deal with these experiments. If we come up against any of the hybrids, you're the one who'll take point." Elena nodded. She didn't have to like it, but she understood. This was her fight. "Understood," she said. Park turned to Carter. "You and Lieutenant Hayes will take the eastern flank. We'll handle the west." With a brief nod from Elena, they proceeded. The air grew colder as they approached the entrance, the shadows lengthening as the light from the transport dimmed behind them. This was it. There would be no more hesitation, no more second-guessing. The mission had to be executed with precision. The stakes were too high. Elena's eyes were locked on the door now, every muscle in her body tense, prepared for the moment they would breach the compound. She didn't flinch when Park pressed a button on his wrist comm, signaling the beginning of their assault. With a hiss of pressure and a faint metallic screech, the door slid open, and they entered the compound. Chapter 18. Into the Abyss. The door slid shut behind them with a hollow metallic clang, cutting off the outside world. The interior of the compound was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of overhead emergency lights, casting long, angular shadows across the walls. The cold, sterile atmosphere was suffocating, and the hum of the ventilation system was the only sound that filled the silence, except for the sound of Elena's heartbeat drumming loudly in her ears. They moved in. Total silence, the team forming a loose perimeter around her as they advanced down the narrow hallway. The walls were concrete, stained with something Elena didn't care to analyze. Every door they passed was reinforced, and every corner they turned seemed to promise more danger lurking just beyond it. This place had been built with one purpose in mind, to house things that were never meant to see the light of day. Elena kept her focus, eyes darting left and right, scanning every shadow, every darkened doorway. She had fought in these kinds of environments before, tactical, oppressive, claustrophobic, but something felt different about this one. The air was thick with the promise of violence, and Elena could taste it on the back of her tongue. Her pulse quickened, and a cold sweat trickled down her neck despite the chill. Lieutenant Carter moved beside her, his weapon raised, his face pale under the dim lights. He was doing his best to stay calm, but Elena could tell he was just as tense as she was. Park led the rear, his steps methodical, measured, his eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced precision. "Eyes open," Elena murmured, voice low and steady, though her own nerves felt like a live wire. They moved deeper into the facility, navigating through a maze of hallways. The walls seemed to close in on them with every step. Elena's breath was shallow as they passed what looked like a reinforced lab, a cold storage area, judging by the heavy steel doors. But there were no windows, no way to see inside. She didn't have time to investigate. The mission was clear. They reached the first junction, and Elena motioned for them to stop. She crouched low, glancing both ways. The facility stretched before them like a labyrinth, but something told her they were getting closer to the heart of the operation. Suddenly, the hum of the ventilation system stuttered. The lights flickered. Elena's stomach dropped. She didn't need to say a word. Her instincts told her they had been detected. "Move!" Elena barked, and without hesitation, the team shifted into motion, sprinting down the hallway toward the next turn. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the corridor behind them. Fast, purposeful. They weren't alone anymore. Elena led the charge, adrenaline sharpening her focus. They rounded the corner and came face to face with a steel door, its surface scuffed and worn from years of use. She could hear something on the other side. Low, guttural growl followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't falter. "Get ready," she muttered, raising her rifle. She motioned for Carter and Park to flank the door, positioning herself in the center. With one swift motion, Elena slammed her shoulder into the door, sending it crashing open. What greeted them was nothing short of hell. The room was vast, a laboratory of sorts filled with metal tables and machines covered in strange instruments. At the far end, a series of tanks, large cylindrical containers filled with murky liquid, lined the walls. Inside, something stirred. Then came the growls. Again, much closer now. Before Elena could react, the tanks exploded open with a deafening roar. Water and glass sprayed across the room, and from within the tanks emerged the hybrids. They weren't like anything she had seen before. These creatures were larger, muscular, distorted. Their features were a grotesque mixture of alien and human, their bodies pulsing with unnatural strength. One of them, a massive, hulking creature with elongated limbs and a twisted, jagged face, roared and charged straight toward Elena. Her instincts took over. She raised her rifle, firing in rapid succession. The first shot hit the creature square in the chest, but it barely flinched. It was like trying to stop a moving mountain with a pebble. It was too powerful, too fast. "Elena!" Carter shouted from the side. She didn't need to be told twice. She dropped and rolled behind a metal table, narrowly avoiding the creature's swipe. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire, but the hybrids were relentless. They advanced faster than anything she had fought before. Their eyes glowed with an eerie yellow hue, their teeth jagged and sharp as they closed in. "Fall back," Elena ordered, but it was already too late. The second hybrid, this one with reptilian scales and glowing red eyes, lunged at Park. He dodged, barely evading its massive claws, but it was clear that they were losing ground fast. The creatures were more than just beasts. They were soldiers, crafted for one thing: to hunt and kill. Elena's mind raced. They had to find a way to stop them. The hybrids were designed for combat. Tough, resilient. Ordinary weapons wouldn't be enough. "Carter!" Elena shouted. "The tanks, we need to destroy them now!" Carter nodded and, without missing a beat, sprinted toward the control panel near the tanks. Elena covered him, firing at the approaching creatures, but her shots seemed to do little more than slow them down. She could feel the heat of their rage as they closed in, their bloodshot eyes locked on her with savage intensity. Park was already on his feet again, coordinating their movements with practiced precision. He turned to Elena as she emptied another magazine. "I'll cover you," he yelled. "Get to Carter." Elena didn't hesitate. She bolted toward Carter, her heart hammering in her chest. The first hybrid lunged at her from the side, but she ducked low and fired, sending it crashing to the floor, but it wasn't enough. Another one was already on her tail, too close. "Carter, now!" she screamed. With a quick, frantic movement, Carter slammed his palm onto the control panel, and the tanks began to hum with power. "No!" a voice screamed from the shadows. Another hybrid. But it was too late. The tanks detonated in a violent explosion of fire and debris, sending shockwaves through the facility. The hybrids howled in agony as the controlled blast ripped through the room, shattering the tanks and turning the entire laboratory into a war zone. Elena felt herself thrown, back by the force of the explosion, her body slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything went black. Chapter 19. Aftermath. The world seemed to slow. Elena's vision swam as she struggled to regain consciousness. Her ears were ringing, and for a long moment, all she could hear was the muffled sound of her own pulse. Her body felt like it had been through a blender. Her head was pounding and her limbs felt heavy as lead. The acrid smell of smoke and burning metal filled her nostrils, mixing with the sharp metallic tang of blood. It took a few long moments for her to push through the haze and blink her eyes open. Her vision swam into focus, and the first thing she saw was the twisted wreckage of the laboratory, the fire from the explosion crackling faintly in the distance, sending up plumes of black smoke that billowed toward the ceiling. She was on the floor, surrounded by debris, her rifle still, clutched tightly in her hands. She could hear movement, shuffling footsteps and low growls, yet they didn't seem to be getting closer. The hybrids had been thrown off balance by the explosion, but that didn't mean they were finished. Not by a long shot. With a groan, Elena pushed herself up, feeling the sting of bruises and cuts across her body. Her head throbbed, but she couldn't afford to stay down. Not now. The mission was still in play and she couldn't let it slip through her fingers. She pushed herself to her feet, her muscles protesting with every movement, and then froze. A low growl reached her ears. Closer this time, from the shadows of the destroyed room, a hybrid emerged, its hulking frame half revealed in the dim light. Its skin was a sickly gray, and the jagged bones protruding from its back glinted in the firelight. The hybrid's eyes locked onto her, and its lips pulled back in a grotesque snarl, revealing rows of serrated teeth. It was fast, too fast, and already it was charging toward her. Without thinking, Elena raised her rifle. She squeezed the trigger, but the shot was shaky, the recoil rattling her already exhausted body. The bullet grazed the hybrid's side, but it did nothing to slow it down. Damn it, Elena muttered under her breath. She needed a plan. She couldn't just shoot her way out, not like this. At the last possible second, something slammed into the creature from the side. Elena's eyes widened in surprise as Carter, breathless and covered in soot, collided with the hybrid, knocking it to the ground with a grunt of effort. "Get down!" Carter yelled, dragging Elena out of the way just as another hybrid lunged at them from behind. Park, appearing from the smoke, was right on its heels, unleashing a burst of gunfire. The hybrid staggered back, a bullet tearing through its shoulder, but it didn't go down. "Cover fire," Park barked. "Get to the control room, now." Carter didn't hesitate. He grabbed Elena by the arm and pulled her toward the ruined corridor they had come from, his grip tight, his face etched with determination. The sound of their boots slamming against the concrete floor echoed in the chaos as they moved, narrowly avoiding another hybrid that emerged from the wreckage. They reached a junction, and Elena could hear more growls reverberating from the halls. Their escape route was quickly closing in. "Stay close," Elena barked, as Carter pulled her down another hallway, just as the sound of a distant explosion shook the compound once more. "They're not stopping," Carter said, his voice grim. "We need to get out of here." "No." Elena's voice was sharp, laced with determination. "Not yet. We still have to find the control room. We can't just run. If we leave now, they'll just rebuild. We need to shut them down once and for all." Carter gave her a brief, understanding look, but it was clear he wasn't thrilled with the idea. The room had already gone to hell. But Elena wasn't going to leave without making sure this was finished. "Let's move," she ordered, her voice cold and unwavering. They pushed forward, their footsteps heavy as they navigated the narrow, debris-strewn hallways. The fire and smoke had thickened, obscuring the path, but Elena pushed through it, feeling the tightness in her chest with each labored breath. Finally, they reached the control room. The doors were heavy, reinforced with steel, but the blast from the explosion had loosened them just enough. Elena shoved one of the doors open, her rifle at the ready as she entered. The room was eerily quiet. Monitors blinked in the dim light, casting greenish glows across the room. There were several rows of computers, control panels, and high-tech equipment lined against the walls, machines built for something far more sinister than ordinary scientific research. But it wasn't the room that had her attention. It was the figure standing at the far end, facing away from her, hunched over a console, fingers moving quickly over the keys. "You're too late," the figure said, their voice soft but filled with an unsettling calm. Elena's pulse quickened as she recognized the silhouette. The figure turned slowly to face her. The light revealed a man she thought she would never see again. "Colonel Park?" Elena gasped, taking a cautious step forward. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow. But there was no mistaking. The man who had been leading them all along, the man who had sent them into this hell, was standing in front of her. But he wasn't the same man. Park smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Did you really think you could stop this, Elena? Did you think a few explosions and a handful of bullets would be enough to stop what's been set in motion?" Her mind was spinning. You're one of them. You've been part of this the whole time?" "Part of it?" Park's smile twisted into something far darker. "I'm not just part of it. I've been guiding it. This is the future, Elena. The future that you were meant to bring about." Her heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer to her, his gaze cold, calculating. "You think you're fighting to save humanity, but you're just delaying the inevitable. These hybrids, they're more than just weapons. They're the next step in evolution. The world you know is dying. It's fragile. But with them, we can reshape everything. We can create something stronger." "No." Elena's voice was trembling with disbelief. "You've lost your mind." Park chuckled darkly. "I haven't lost anything. I've gained everything. The hybrids, the experiments, they're only the beginning. You were always part of the plan, Elena. Whether you realized it or not." Elena stepped back, her mind racing. Everything she had believed about this mission, the things she had fought for, were unraveling. She had trusted Park. She had followed him, believing in the mission. And now she realized with a sickening jolt that he had been playing them all along. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Chapter 20. Betrayal. Elena's chest tightened as the weight of Park's words sank in. The foundation beneath her feet seemed to crack, her entire world tilting on its axis. The man she had trusted, who had guided them through the horrors of the hybrid experiments, who had stood by her through every mission, was now standing before her as the architect of it all. Her mind raced. The mission had always felt like a fight for survival, but she had never expected this. Park wasn't just some misguided soldier. He was the one who had orchestrated the horrors that had taken so many lives. And now he was revealing his true intentions. The hybrids were his creation, his soldiers, and Elena had unknowingly been helping him bring about this future. "You're insane," Elena spat, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "You think you can just replace humanity? Use these monsters to take over the world?" Park's eyes glinted with something darker, a twisted satisfaction curling the corners of his lips. "You don't understand. The world has been stagnant for too long, Elena, weak. It's been in decline for decades. He motioned to the monitors and the chaos outside, the sounds of distant gunfire and the growls of hybrids echoing through the compound. "This is the beginning of a new age. The hybrids will bring about a better world, a world of strength, of survival. Everything you've ever known will be reshaped." "You're delusional," Elena shot back. "You're nothing more than a puppet for your own twisted desires. This isn't evolution. It's a damn slaughter." Park's gaze flickered, but there was no sign of remorse. Instead, his expression hardened, almost as if he were disappointed. "I thought you'd understand, Elena. You were meant for this. The moment you stepped into this fight, you were a part of the plan. You have more in common with them than you realize." Elena took a step back, her mind reeling. The thought that she had been a part of Park's sick vision, she couldn't wrap her head around it. She wasn't one of them. She had never been one of them. She had fought for humanity, for survival, for life. But Park was right about one thing. The world was changing. The war they were fighting now wasn't just about survival. It was about choice. And she had one. Stand and let the world burn. Or fight to stop the fire before it consumed everything. Without warning, Elena snapped out of her daze. Her eyes narrowed, and she steadied her grip on her rifle. There was no room for hesitation now. There was only one thing left to do. "I'll stop you," she said, her voice cold and filled with resolve. "No matter what it takes." Park smiled, as though her words amused him. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You can try, but it's already too late. The process has started. The hybrids will soon be everywhere. You'll see. The world will adapt, whether you like it or not." Before Elena could react, a loud crash reverberated through the compound. Something massive had just collided with the walls. Her heart skipped a beat. The hybrid army was closing in. The monitors around them blinked to life with flashing red warnings. Park's face twisted into an expression of satisfaction, as though the chaos unfolding around them was exactly what he had been waiting for. Elena glanced around. She had no time to waste. If she didn't stop Park now, there would, be nothing left to save. "Get down," Park suddenly shouted, lunging toward one of the control panels. The room shuddered as another explosion rang out, closer this time, and Elena barely ducked behind a console just as a burst of shrapnel flew through the air. She ducked low, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She couldn't let him turn this facility into a weapon. Not when the hybrids were still out of control. Carter's voice crackled through her calm, weak but urgent. "Elena, we're on our way. We've got hybrids on the move. It's a full-scale breach." Park's fingers flew over the controls, and with a flash of warning lights, the metal doors to the room slammed shut, sealing them in. The air grew thick with tension. "You're running out of time," Park sneered. "The self-destruct sequence has already been initiated. You have 5 minutes to decide. Fight me or let everything burn." Elena's stomach dropped as she scanned the room for any way out. She could hear the unmistakable thumping of hybrid, feet growing closer, the growls of creatures reverberating through the walls. No, she couldn't let him win. Not like this. She made a snap decision, sprinting toward the far side of the room where the last unprotected control terminal sat. She had to stop the self-destruct before it was too late. There was no choice. If she didn't act, they'd all be trapped in this hellhole with the hybrids closing in. Park's voice followed her, taunting and cruel. "You think you can stop this? You're wasting your time, Elena. You've already lost." The room went quiet. Then with a soft click, the countdown halted. For a brief moment, Elena allowed herself to breathe. But that peace was short-lived. The door behind her exploded with force, and a massive hybrid barreled through, its eyes wild with hunger. Elena spun around, raising her rifle just in time. She fired once, twice, 3 times, each bullet piercing the creature's thick hide, but it barely slowed. She wasn't going to last long against something that strong. A sudden burst of gunfire from behind her made the creature stagger. It shrieked in pain and turned toward the new threat. It was Carter and Park, both emerging from the smoke and debris. "Fall back," Park shouted, his gun blazing. "Elena, go!" She hesitated for a moment, watching the 2 men fight. Park was still moving toward the control panel, his face cold and determined. Carter, on the other hand, was focused entirely on keeping Elena safe. Her heart hammered as she made the split-second decision to trust them. For now. But the hybrids were coming from all sides. The room was filling with their savage growls, their hunger a tangible force that made Elena's skin crawl. There was no more time for contemplation. "Move!" Carter shouted again, grabbing her by the arm. They ran, breaking through the compounds, narrow corridors, desperately trying to find their way out before the facility collapsed in on itself. Behind them, the growls grew louder, the air thick with the unmistakable scent of death. Elena's mind raced with everything that had happened. The betrayal, the chaos, the horrifying truth. But as they sprinted through the hellish compound, one thing was clear: this fight wasn't over, and she would make sure it never would be. Chapter 21. Escape. The sound of the hybrid's growls reverberated through the halls, growing louder with every step they took. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder, faster. The walls of the bay compound seemed to close in, the metallic corridors twisting and turning, all the while echoing with the unnatural sounds of the creatures pursuing them. Carter was leading the way now, his face grim as he moved with practiced urgency. Lena followed, trying to keep her focus sharp, but the weight of everything that had happened, Park's betrayal, the destruction of the self-destruct sequence, the hybrids flooding the facility, had her nerves fraying at the edges. Every shadow, every creak of the building felt like a threat, and she couldn't help but feel the gnawing terror that they were running out of time. "Keep moving," Carter's voice cut through the haze of her thoughts. "The exits are up ahead." Elena nodded, though she knew the path wouldn't be easy. They had to get through the main compound entrance, but Park's warning still echoed in her mind. The self-destruct sequence had been triggered. They had minutes, maybe less, before this entire place came down around them. They reached a large set of doors, heavily reinforced, blocking their escape. Carter paused, quickly assessing the situation. He didn't hesitate. "Cover me," he ordered. Without waiting for a response, Carter knelt, slamming a charge against the door's weak point. The door was solid, but they had no time to waste on subtlety. Elena didn't need to be told twice. She took position beside a corner, rifle raised, eyes scanning for any sign of the hybrids. Every moment was precious now. The charge detonated, with a deafening boom, sending a shockwave through the hallway. Elena's ears rang, and for a split second she feared they might be too late. But the door buckled, a jagged hole blasted through the steel, and Carter was already moving, a blur of motion as he darted through the gap. "Go!" he shouted. Elena followed immediately, heart hammering as she sprinted toward the open exit, her mind half on the chaos behind them, half on the escape route ahead. They were close now, so close to freedom. The blast had created a clear path, but the compound was far from silent. The roar of the hybrids, their guttural screeches echoing from every direction, made the hairs on the back of Elena's neck stand on end. They were closing in. "Carter, how much farther?" Elena called out, her breath ragged, voice barely above a whisper. Carter didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked back toward the hall they had just come from, the gunfire from their side, keeping the creatures at bay for now. But the growls were getting closer, the unmistakable sound of feet pounding against the concrete floors. "We're almost there," he said, his voice strained. And then, a sound from behind them. Sharp, like a growl but distinct. A roar of pain. Elena froze, her pulse spiking. She whipped around, looking through the haze of smoke and dust, just in time to see Park stumbling toward them, covered in blood. His face was twisted with fury, but there was no mistaking the way his body swayed, the signs of a struggle clearly evident. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a hybrid, the one Park had sent to finish them off, loomed. Its massive claws scraped against the ground, its eyes fixed on Park as it lumbered forward, its snarls vibrating through the air. "Park!" Elena shouted, urgency flooding her voice. "Get out of here!" But Park's eyes met hers, and for a brief, unsettling moment, their gazes locked. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite place. Something dark, something final. Then he turned his attention back to the hybrid, his hand reaching for a sidearm. "Run." "Elena!" Park's voice was hoarse, but his command was clear. The hybrid closed the distance, its claws slashing through the air. Park fired twice, the shots echoing in the corridor, but they had no effect on the creature. It swiped, sending him crashing into the wall with a sickening crack. Elena felt her stomach drop. "No!" she screamed, but Carter yanked her forward. "Elena, we don't have time," he shouted, his grip on her arm firm, pulling her along despite her resistance. She hesitated, torn between the need to save Park and the desperate need to survive. But the hybrid was too close, and Park's chances of escaping alive were slipping. By the second, he had made his choice. He had set the course for this moment. Reluctantly, she tore her eyes away from the fight and ran, but every step felt like an eternity. The sounds of the hybrid's growls and Park's final pained shout echoed in her mind as she pushed herself harder. The exit came into view, a large open garage door. Outside, the remnants of the compound were visible, flames licking the night sky, the ruins of what had been a heavily fortified installation now crumbling under the weight of its own failure. "Elena!" Carter's voice pulled her from her. "Easy. We're almost there." She forced herself to focus, her pulse racing, her breath ragged. They had to make it. They had to survive. They reached the door. Carter was already at the controls, his fingers flying across the panel. With a screech, the massive door began to lift. And for a brief, terrifying moment, Elena wondered if it would stop, if the hybrids would catch up before they could escape. Then, the door opened wide enough for them to squeeze through. The night air hit her like a slap, cold and sharp, and she took in a deep breath, savoring the taste of freedom. But they weren't out of danger yet. They still had to get away. Without another word, they bolted outside, the sound of the door slamming shut behind them. The compound, now fully engulfed in flames, was still visible, the fire crackling with a ferocity that matched the chaos inside. They ran toward a nearby vehicle, an armored transport abandoned in the chaos of the attack. Carter reached it first, yanking open the door and pulling Elena inside. "Go, go, go," Carter barked, and the engine roared to life, its tires kicking up gravel as they sped away from the compound. Elena barely had time to catch her breath before the distant sound of an explosion echoed behind them. A massive shockwave rumbled through the ground, and she glanced back just in time to see the compound collapsing, flames and debris rising into the sky like a terrible beacon of destruction. They were free, for now, but Elena knew this was far from over. The hybrid threat wasn't something they could just outrun, and Park's twisted vision hadn't ended with the destruction of the compound. If anything, it was only the beginning. The world was changing, and they had a long fight ahead of them. Elena sat back in the seat, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what the next step would be, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a fight for the future. And she was going to make sure it was one worth living. Epilogue. The dawn of a new world months had passed since the destruction of the compound. The ruins, once a testament to mankind's darkest ambitions, now lay buried beneath the weight of time, flames, and the earth itself. But the scars left behind were far deeper, more permanent than any structure. The hybrid threat had not been eradicated. It had only been delayed. Elena stood on a rocky cliff, staring out at the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to rise. The sky was streaked with reds, pinks, and purples, a stark contrast to the blackness of the night that had once seemed endless. In the distance, she could see the first traces of civilization beginning to rebuild. Cities, towns, communities, small, but resilient, were cropping up along the borders of the destruction. There was hope in the air, but it was fragile, easily shattered. Behind her, Carter stood silent, his gaze fixed on the same distant line where the earth met the sky. His face was older, harder, and yet there was something softer in his eyes now. Something that had been missing for so long. "What happens now?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace she was clinging to. Carter sighed and ran a hand through his dark hair. "We rebuild, we organize, we fight if we have to, but we don't stop living." Elena nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the gun belt at her waist. She had kept it, the reminder of all the lives they had lost, of the things she had had to do to survive. But it wasn't the only thing she carried with her anymore. There was something else now, a sense of purpose, a realization that the battle was far from over, and she would be there to see it through to the end. "The hybrids aren't gone," she said quietly, turning to look at him. "Park's vision, his plan, it's still out there. Those creatures, that virus, they're not something we can just ignore." Carter gave a small, grim smile, though there was a quiet fire in his eyes. "I know. And we're not just going to sit back and wait for it to find us. The world's not as blind as it was before. We've got allies now, people who believe in this fight, who believe in humanity. And if we can't stop them?" Elena asked, her voice raw. "Then we fight until we can." Carter turned his gaze toward the horizon once more, his expression steady. Because we've seen what happens when we don't. A chill ran down Elena's spine, not from the wind, but from the memory of the nightmare that had been the hybrid apocalypse. The bodies, the destruction, the way the world had almost crumbled under the weight of one man's ambition. And yet, there was still hope. In the faces of the survivors, in the efforts to rebuild, in the strength of those willing to stand up and fight. They had stopped one part of the nightmare, but the war was not over. Park had been the catalyst, but the disease, the hybrid's twisted form of evolution, was still alive. There were others out there, perhaps waiting for the right moment to strike again. But now, there were people who knew how to fight back. "We've got work to do," Elena said, her voice gaining strength with every word. Carter turned to her, his expression fierce. "We are not going to stop until the world is safe. We'll do it together, Elena, all of us. Together." The word echoed in her mind. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about resistance, about standing together in the face of something larger than themselves. A new war, one where they weren't just fighting to live, but to reclaim a future. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the earth and sea. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze wash over her, feeling the weight of the world, slowly settling into place. It wasn't the end. She knew that. It was just another beginning, a beginning where every victory mattered, where every choice could mean the difference between life and death. But they weren't alone anymore, and that thought, more than anything, gave her the strength to face what lay ahead. Months later, the world had begun to rebuild piece by piece. Small resistance cells dotted the globe, each of them finding their own ways to counter the hybrid threat, sharing intel, strengthening defenses, and educating the next generation of fighters. Some of them were former soldiers like Carter and Elena. Others were civilians who had seen their lives torn apart by the hybrid epidemic. But all of them were united by the same purpose: to prevent the horrors of the past from rising again. Elena and Carter stood on the rooftop of a newly established safe house, overlooking the growing city below, a beacon of hope that, despite everything, humanity would endure. Behind them, in the control room, a team of specialists worked tirelessly, piecing together intelligence from old military databases, intercepting communications, and tracking down remnants of the hybrid virus. The war wasn't over, but they were making strides, finding weaknesses, forming alliances, and preparing for whatever came next. A young technician entered the room, holding a secure, encrypted file. He handed it to Carter with a serious look on his face. "What is it?" Elena asked, her hand instinctively going to her sidearm. Carter opened the file, his brow furrowing as he scanned the information. "It's from one of our informants," Carter said, turning to Elena. "There's something new, a new mutation, something even more dangerous than before." Elena felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but she didn't hesitate. "Then we'll deal with it, like we always do." And with that, they turned toward the unknown future, ready to face whatever came their way, together. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Let me know in the comments what ideas you would like the next story to be about. Please leave a thumbs up, share, subscribe, comment.